Part 1, Chapter 26 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel. The next forenoon Levin left Moscow, and toward evening was at home. On the journey he talked with those near him in the train about politics, about the new railroads, and, just as in Moscow, he was overcome by the chaos of conflicting opinions, self-dissatisfaction, and a sense of shame. But when he got out at his station, and perceived his one-eyed coachman, Ignat, with his kaftan collar turned up, when he saw, in the dim light that fell through the station windows, his covered sledge and his horses with their tied-up tails, and their harness with its rings and fringes, when Ignat, as he was tucking in the robes, told him all the news of the village, about the coming of the contractor and how Pava the cow had calved, then it seemed to him that the chaos resolved itself a little, and his shame and dissatisfaction passed away. This he felt at the very sight of Ignat and his horses. But as soon as he had put on his sheepskin tulip, which he found in the sleigh, and took his seat in the sleigh comfortably wrapped up, and drove off thinking what arrangements he should have to make in the village, and at the same time examining off the horse, Donskaya, which used to be his saddle-horse, a jaded but mettlesome steed, he began to view his experiences in an absolutely different light. He felt himself again, and no longer wished to be a different person. He only wished to be better than he had ever been before. In the first place, he resolved from that day forth that he would never expect extraordinary joys, such as marriage had promised to bring to him, and therefore he would never again despise the present. And, in the second place, he would never allow himself to be led away by low passion, the remembrances of which so tortured him while he was deciding to make his proposal. And lastly, as he thought of his brother Nikolai, he resolved that he would never again forget him, but that he would keep track of him and not let him out of sight, so that he might be in readiness to aid him whenever the evil moment arrived, and that seemed likely to be very soon. Then the conversation about communism, which he had so lightly treated with his brother, came back to him, and made him reflect. A reform of economic conditions seemed to him nonsense, but he always felt the unfair difference between his own superfluity and the poverty of the people, and in order that he might feel perfectly right, he now vowed that though hitherto he had worked hard and lived economically, he would in the future work still harder and permit himself even less luxury than ever. And all this seemed to him so easy to accomplish that, throughout the drive from the station, he was the subject of the pleasantest illusions. With a hearty feeling of hope for a new and better life, he reached home just as the clock was striking 10. From the windows of the room occupied by his old nurse, Agafya Mikhailovna, who fulfilled the functions of housekeeper, the light fell on the snow-covered walk before his house. She was not yet asleep. Kuzma, wakened by her, hurried down, barefooted and sleepy, to open the door. Laska, the setter, almost knocking Kuzma down in her desire to get ahead of him, ran to meet her master and jumped upon him, trying to place her forepaws on his breast. "You are back very soon, Batyushka," said Agafya Mikhailovna. "I was bored, Agafya Mikhailovna. It is good to go visiting, but it's better at home," said he, and he went into his library. The library slowly grew light as the candle that was brought burnt up. The familiar details little by little came into sight: the great antlers, the shelves lined with books, the mirror, the stove with a hole which ought long ago to have been repaired, the ancestral divan, the great table, and on the table an open book, a broken ash-tray, a notebook filled with his writing. As he saw all these things, for a moment the doubt arose in his mind if it would be possible to bring about this new life which he had dreamed of during his journey. All these signs of his past seemed to say to him, "No, thou shalt not leave us, thou shalt not become another, but thou shalt still be as thou hast always been, with thy doubts, thy everlasting self-dissatisfaction, thy idle efforts at reform, thy failures, and thy perpetual strivings for a happiness which will never be thine." But while these external objects spoke to him thus, a different voice whispered to his soul, bidding him cease to be a slave to his past, and declaring that a man has every possibility within him. And, listening to this voice, he went to one side of the room, where he found two 40-pound dumb-bells, and he began to practice his gymnastic exercises with them, endeavoring to bring himself into a condition of vigor. At the door there was a noise of steps. He hastily put down the dumb-bells. The intendant came in and said that, thanks to God, everything was all right, but he confessed that the buckwheat in the new drawing-room had got burnt. This provoked Levin. This new drawing-room he had himself built and partially invented. But the intendant had been entirely opposed to it, and now he announced with ill-concealed triumph that the buckwheat was burnt. Levin was sure that it was because he had neglected the precautions 100 times suggested. He grew angry and reprimanded the intendant. But there was one fortunate and important event. Pava, his best, his most beautiful cow, which he had bought at the cattle show, had calved. "Kuzma, give me my tulip. And you," he said to the intendant, "get a lantern. I will go and see her." The stable for the cattle was immediately behind the house. Crossing the courtyard, where the snow was heaped under the lilac bushes, he stepped up to the stable. As he opened the frosty door, he was met by the warm fumes of manure, and the cows, astonished at the untaught light of the lantern, stirred on their fresh straw. The light fell upon the broad black back of his piebald Holland cow. Berkut, the bull, with a ring in his nose, tried to get to his feet, but changed his mind, and only snorted as they passed by. The beautiful Pava, huge as a hippopotamus, was lying near her calf, snuffing at it, and protecting it against those who would come too close. Levin entered the stall, examined Pava, and lifted the calf, spotted with red and white, on its long awkward legs. Pava began to low with anxiety, but was reassured when the calf was restored to her, and began to lick it with her rough tongue. The calf hid its nose under its mother's side, and frisked its tail. "Bring the light this way, Fyodor, this way," said Levin, examining the calf. "Like its mother, but its color is like the sire's. Very pretty. Long hair and prettily spotted. Vasily Fyodorovitch, isn't it a beauty?" he said, turning to his intendant, forgetting, in his joy over the newborn calf, the grief caused by the burning of his wheat. "Why should it be homely? But Semyon the contractor was here the day after you left. It will be necessary to come to terms with him, Konstantin Dmitrich," replied the intendant. "I have already spoken to you about the machine." This single phrase brought Levin back to all the details of his enterprise, which was great and complicated. And from the stable he went directly to the office, and after a long conversation with the intendant and Semyon the contractor, he went back to the house, and marched straight up to the drawing-room. Chapter 27 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Levin's house was old and large, but, though he lived there alone, he occupied and warmed the whole of it. He knew that this was ridiculous. He knew that it was bad and contrary to his new plans, but this house was a world in itself to him. It was a world where his father and mother had lived and died. They had lived a life which, for Levin, seemed the ideal of all perfection, and which he dreamed of renewing with his own wife, with his own family. Levin scarcely remembered his mother, but this remembrance was sacred, and his future wife, as he imagined her, was to be the counterpart of the ideally charming and adorable woman, his mother. For him, the love of a woman could not exist outside of marriage, but he imagined the family relationship first, and only afterwards the woman who would be the center of the family. His ideas about marriage were therefore essentially different from those held by the majority of his friends, for whom it was only one of innumerable social affairs. For Levin, it was the most important act of his life, whereon all his happiness depended, and now he must renounce it. When he entered the little parlour where he always took tea, and threw himself into his armchair with a book, while Agafya Mikhailovna brought him his cup, and sat near the window, saying as usual, "Well, I'll sit down, Batiushka," then he felt, strangely enough, that he had not renounced his daydreams, and that he could not live without them. Were it Kitty or another, still it would be. He read his book, had his mind on what he was reading, pausing occasionally to listen to Agafya Mikhailovna's unceasing prattle, but his imagination was all the time filled with those varied pictures of family happiness which hovered before him. He felt that in the depths of his soul some change, some modification, some crystallization was taking place. He listened while Agafya Mikhailovna told how Prokhor had forgotten God, and, instead of buying a horse with the money which Levin had given him, had taken it and gone on a spree, and beaten his wife almost to death. And while he listened he read his book, and again caught the thread of his thoughts, awakened by his reading. It was a book by Tyndall on heat. He remembered his criticisms on Tyndall's self-satisfaction in the cleverness of his management of his experiments and on his lack of philosophical views, and suddenly a happy thought crossed his mind. In 2 years I shall have 2 Holland cows, perhaps Pava herself will still be alive, and possibly a dozen of Berkut's daughters will have been added to the herd, just from these 3. Splendid! And again he picked up his book. Well, very good. Electricity and heat are one and the same thing. But could one quantity take the place of the other in the equations used to settle this problem? No. What then? The bond between all forces of nature is felt, like instinct. When Pava's daughter grows into a cow with red and white spots, what a herd I shall have with those 3. Admirable! And my wife and I will go out with our guests to see the herd come in, and my wife will say, "Kostya and I have brought this calf up just like a child." "How can this interest you so?" the guests will say. "All that interests him interests me also." But who will she be? And he began to think of what happened in Moscow. Well, what is to be done about it? I am not to blame, but now everything will be different. It is foolishness to let one's past life dominate the present. One must struggle to live better, much better. He raised his head and sank into thought. Old Alaska, who had not yet got over her delight at her master's return, had been barking up and down the courtyard. She came into the room, wagging her tail and bringing the freshness of the open air, and thrust her head under his hand and begged for a caress, whining plaintively. "She almost talks," said Agafya Mikhailovna. "She is only a dog, but she knows just as well that her master has come home and is sad." "Why sad?" "Da, don't I see it, Batiushka? It's time I knew how to read my masters. Grew up with my masters since they were children. No matter, Batiushka, your health is good and your conscience pure." Levin looked at her earnestly, in astonishment that she so divined his thoughts. "And shall I give you some more tea?" said she, and taking the cup, she went out. Laska continued to nestle her head in her master's hand. He caressed her, and then she curled herself up around his feet, like a ring, laying her head on one of her hind paws, and, as proof that all was arranged to suit her, she opened her mouth a little, let her tongue slip out between her aged teeth, and, with a gentle puffing of her lips, gave herself up to beatific repose. Levin followed all of her movements. "So will I," said he to himself. "So will I. No matter. All will be well." Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Early on the morning after the ball, Anna Arkadyevna sent her husband a telegram announcing that she was going to leave Moscow that day. "No, I must go," she said to her sister-in-law, in explanation of her change of plan, and her tone signified that she had just remembered something that demanded her instant attention. "No, it would be much better if I could go this morning." Stepan Arkadyevitch did not dine at home, but he agreed to be back at 7 o'clock to escort his sister to the train. Kitty did not put in an appearance, but sent word that she had a headache. Dolly and Anna dined alone with the children and the English governess. Either the children were fickle or they were very sensitive and felt that Anna was not at all as she had been on the day when they had taken so kindly to her, that she no longer cared for them, for they suddenly ceased playing with their aunt, seemed to lose their affection for her, and cared very little that she was going away. Anna spent the whole morning in making the preparations for her departure. She wrote a few notes to her Moscow acquaintances, settled her accounts, and packed. To Dolly especially it seemed that she was not in a happy frame of mind, but in that state of mental agitation which Dolly knew from experience arose, not without excellent reason, from dissatisfaction with herself. After dinner Anna went to her room to dress, and Dolly followed her. "How strange you are to-day," said Dolly. "I? Do you think so? I am not strange, but I am cross. This is common with me. I should like to have a good cry. It is very silly, but it will pass away," said Anna, speaking quickly, and hiding her blushing face in a little bag where she was packing her toilet articles and her handkerchiefs. Her eyes shone with tears which she could hardly keep back. "I was so loath to come away from Petersburg, and now I don't want to go back." "You came here, and you did a lovely thing," said Dolly, attentively observing her. Anna looked at her with eyes wet with tears. "Don't say that, Dolly. I have done nothing, and could do nothing. I often ask myself why people say things to spoil me. What have I done? What could I do? You found that your heart had enough love left to forgive. Without you, God knows what would have been. How fortunate you are, Anna," said Dolly. "All is serene and pure in your soul. Everyone has a skeleton in his closet, as the English say." "What skeleton have you, pray? In you everything is so serene." "I have mine," cried Anna suddenly, and an unexpected, crafty, mocking smile hovered over her lips in spite of her tears. "Well, in your case the skeleton must be a droll one and not grievous," replied Dolly with a smile. "No, it is grievous. Do you know why I go to-day and not to-morrow? This is a confession which weighs me down, but I wish to make it," said Anna decidedly, sitting down in an armchair and looking Dolly straight in the eyes. And to her astonishment she saw that Anna was blushing, even to her ears, even to the dark curls that played around the back of her neck. "Yes," Anna proceeded. "Do you know why Kitty did not come to dinner? She is jealous of me. I spoiled. It was through me that the ball last night was a torment and not a joy to her. But truly, truly, I was not to blame, or not much to blame," she said, with a special accent on the word "nemnozko," not much. "Oh, how exactly you said that like Stiva," remarked Dolly, laughing. Anna was vexed. "Oh, no, I am not like Stiva," said she, frowning. "I have told you this simply because I do not allow myself, for an instant, to doubt myself." But the very moment that she said these words she perceived how untrue they were. She not only doubted herself, but she felt such emotion at the thought of Vronsky that she took her departure sooner than she otherwise would, so that she might not meet him again. "Yes, Stiva told me that you danced the mazurka with him, and that he. You cannot imagine how ridiculously it turned out. I thought only to help along the match, and suddenly it went exactly opposite. Perhaps against my will, I." She blushed and did not finish her sentence. "Oh, these things are felt instantly," said Dolly. "I should be in despair if I felt that there was anything serious on his part," interrupted Anna. "But I am convinced that all this will be quickly forgotten, and that Kitty will not long be angry with me." "In the first place, Anna, to tell the truth, I should not be very sorry if this marriage fell through. It would be vastly better for it to stop right here if Vronsky can fall in love with you in a single day." "Oh heavens! That would be so idiotic," said Anna, and again an intense blush of satisfaction overspread her face at hearing the thought that occupied her expressed in words. "And that is why I go away, after making an enemy of Kitty, whom I love so dearly. Oh, how sweet she is! But you will arrange that, Dolly, won't you?" Dolly could hardly refrain from smiling. She loved Anna, but it was pleasant to her to discover that she also had her weaknesses. "An enemy? That cannot be." "And I should have been so glad to have you all love me as I love you. But now I love you all the more than ever," said Anna, with tears in her eyes. "Oh, how absurd I am to-day!" She passed her handkerchief over her eyes and began to get ready. At the very moment of her departure came Stepan Arkadyevitch with rosy, happy face and an odor of wine and cigars. Anna's tender-heartedness had communicated itself to Dolly, and, when she kissed her for the last time, she whispered, "Think, Anna, what you have done for me. I shall never forget. And remember that I love you, and always shall love you as my best friend." "I don't understand why," replied Anna, kissing her and struggling with her tears. "You have understood me, and you do understand me. Farewell, my dearest." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. "Well, all is over, and thank the Lord," was Anna's first thought after she had said good-bye to her brother, who had blocked up the entrance to the railway carriage even after the third bell had rung. She sat down on the divanchik next Annushka, her maid, and began to examine the feebly lighted compartment. "Thank the Lord! Tomorrow I shall see Seroza and Alexey Alexandrovitch, and my good and commonplace life will begin again as of old." With the same mental preoccupation that had possessed her all that day, Anna found a satisfaction in attending minutely to the arrangements for the journey. With her skillful little hands she opened her red bag and took out a cushion, placed it on her knees, wrapped her feet warmly, and composed herself comfortably. A lady, who seemed to be an invalid, had already gone to sleep. Two other ladies entered into conversation with Anna, and a fat elderly dame, well wrapped up, expressed her opinion on the temperature. Anna exchanged a few words with the ladies, but, not taking any interest in their conversation, asked Annushka for her travelling lamp, placed it on the back of her seat, and took from her bag a paper cutter and an English novel. At first she could not read. The going and coming and the general bustle disturbed her. When once the train had started, she could not help listening to the noises, the snow striking against the window and sticking to the glass, the conductor, as he passed, with the snowflakes melting on his coat, the remarks about the terrible storm, all distracted her attention. Afterwards it became more monotonous, always the same jolting and jarring, the same snow on the window, the same sudden changes from warmth to cold, and back to warmth again, the same faces in the dim light, and the same voices. And Anna began to read, and to follow what she was reading. Annushka was already asleep, holding the little red bag on her knees with great, clumsy hands clad in gloves, one of which was torn. Anna read, and understood what she read, but it was not pleasant to her to read, in other words, to enter into the lives of other people. She had too keen a desire to live herself. If she read how the heroine of her story took care of the sick, she would have liked to go with noiseless steps into the sick room. If she read how a member of Parliament made a speech, she would have liked to make that speech. If she read how Lady Mary rode after the hounds, and made sport of her sister-in-law, and astonished everyone by her audacity, she would have liked to do the same. But she could do nothing, and with her little hands she clutched the paper cutter, and forced herself to read calmly. The hero of her novel had reached the summit of his English ambition, a baronetcy and an estate, and Anna felt a desire to go with him to this estate, when suddenly it seemed to her that he ought to feel a sense of shame, and that she ought to share it. But why should he feel ashamed? Why should I feel ashamed? She asked herself with astonishment and discontent. She closed the book, and, leaning back against the chair, held the paper cutter tightly in both hands. There was nothing to be ashamed of. She reviewed all her memories of her visit to Moscow. They were all pleasant and good. She remembered the ball. She remembered Vronsky and his humble and passionate face. She recalled all her relations with him. There was nothing to be ashamed of. But at the same time, in these reminiscences, the sense of shame kept growing stronger and stronger, and it seemed to her that inward voice, whenever she thought of Vronsky, seemed to say, warmly, very warmly, passionately. "Well, what is this?" she asked herself resolutely, as she changed her position in the seat. "What does this mean? Am I afraid to face these memories? Well, what is it? Can there be, any relationship between that boy officer and me beyond what exists between all acquaintances?" She smiled disdainfully, and again took up her book. But now she really could not any longer comprehend what she was reading. She rubbed her paper cutter over the pane, and then pressed its cool, smooth surface to her cheek, and then she almost laughed out loud with the joy that unreasonably took possession of her. She felt her nerves grow more and more tense, like the strings on some musical instrument screwed up to the last degree. She felt her eyes open wider and wider. Her fingers and her toes twitched nervously. Something seemed to choke her, and all objects and sounds in the wavering semi-darkness surprised her by their exaggerated proportions. She kept having moments of doubt as to whether they were going backwards or forwards, or if the train had come to a stop. Was it Annushka there, sitting next to her, or was it a stranger? "What is that on the hook? My fur shuba, or an animal? And what am I doing here? Am I myself, or someone else?" It was terrible to her to yield to these hallucinations, but something kept attracting her to them, and she could by her own will either yield to them or withdraw from them. In order to regain possession of herself, Anna arose, took off her plaid, and laid aside her pelerine of thick cloth. For a moment she thought that she had conquered herself, for when a tall, thick muzhik, dressed in a long nankeen overcoat, which lacked a button, came in, she recognized in him the stove-tender. She saw him look at the thermometer, and noticed how the wind and the snow came blowing in as he opened the door, and then everything became confused again. The tall peasant began to draw fantastic figures on the wall. The old lady seemed to stretch out her legs and fill the whole carriage as with a black cloud. Then she thought she heard terrible thumping and rapping, a noise like something tearing. Then a red and blinding fire flashed in her eyes, and then all vanished in darkness. Anna felt as if she was falling, but this was not at all alarming, but rather pleasant. The voice of a man all wrapped up and covered with snow shouted something in her ear. She sat up, recovered her wits, and perceived that they were approaching a station, and the man was the conductor. She bade Annushka give her the pelerine which she had laid aside, and her handkerchief, and, having put them on, she went to the door. "Do you wish to go out?" asked Annushka. "Yes, I want to get a breath of fresh air. It is very hot here." And she opened the door. The snowstorm and the wind rushed in to meet her, and disputed the door with her. And this seemed to her very jolly. The storm seemed to be waiting for her. It gaily whistled and was eager to carry her away. But she clung to the cold railing with one hand, and, holding her dress, she stepped out on the platform and left the car. The wind was fierce on the steps, but on the platform, under the shelter of the station, it was calmer, and she found a genuine pleasure in filling her lungs with the frosty air. Standing near the car, she watched the platform and the station gleaming with lights. End of chapter 29. 30 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. A furious snowstorm was raging and whistling among the wheels of the carriages, around the columns and into the corners of the station. The carriages, the pillars, the people, everything visible, were covered on one side with snow, and it was increasing momently. Once in a while there would be a lull, but then again it blew with such gusts that it seemed impossible to make way against it. Meantime a few people were running hither and thither, talking gaily, opening and shutting the great doors of the station, and making the platform planks creak under their feet. The flitting shadow of a man passed rapidly by her feet, and she heard the blows of a hammer falling on the iron. "Send off the telegram!" cried an angry voice on the other side of the track in the midst of the drifting storm. "This way, please, number 28," cried other voices, and several people covered with snow hurried by. Two gentlemen, with lighted cigarettes in their mouths, passed near Anna. She was just about to re-enter the carriage, after getting one more breath of fresh air, and had already taken her hand from her muff to lay hold of the railing, when the flickering light from the reflector was cut off by a man in a military coat, who came close to her. She looked up, and that instant recognized Vronsky's face. Raising his hand to his visor, he bowed low, and asked if she needed anything, if he might not be of service to her. She looked at him for a considerable time without replying, and although he was in the shadow, she saw, or thought she saw, the expression of his face, and even of his eyes. It was a repetition of that respectful admiration which had so impressed her on the evening of the ball. More than once that day she had said to herself that Vronsky, for her, was only one of the 100 young men whom one meets in society, that she would never permit herself to give him a second thought. But now, on the first instant of seeing him again, a sensation of pride and joy seized her. She had no need to ask why he was there. She knew, as truly as if he had told her, that he was there so as to be where she was. "I did not know that you were going to Petersburg. Why are you going?" said she, letting her hand fall from the railing. A joy which she could not restrain shone in her face. "Why am I going?" he repeated, looking straight into her eyes. "You know that I came simply for this, to be where you are," he said. "I could not do otherwise." And at this instant the wind, as if it had conquered every obstacle, blew the snow from the roofs of the carriages, and whirled away a piece of sheet iron which it had torn off, and at the same time the deep whistle of the locomotive gave a melancholy, mournful cry. Never had the horror of a tempest appeared to her more beautiful than now. He had said what her heart longed to hear, but what her better judgment condemned. She made no reply, but he perceived by her face how she fought against herself. "Forgive me if what I said displeases you," he murmured humbly. He spoke respectfully, courteously, but in such a resolute, decided tone, that for some time she was unable to reply. "What you said was wrong, and I beg of you, if you are a gentleman, to forget it, as I shall forget it," she said at last. "I shall never forget, and I shall never be able to forget any of your words, any of your gestures. Enough, enough!" she cried, vainly endeavoring to give an expression of severity to her face, at which Vronsky was passionately gazing. And grasping the cold railing, she mounted the steps and quickly entered the vestibule of the carriage. But she stopped in the little vestibule, and tried to recall to her imagination what had taken place. But though she found it impossible to remember either her own words or his, she instinctively felt that this brief conversation had brought them frightfully close together, and that she was at once alarmed and delighted. After she had stood there a few seconds, she went back into the carriage and sat down in her place. The nervous strain which had been tormenting her not only returned, but became more intense, until she began to fear every moment that something would snap her brain. She did not sleep all night, but in this nervous tension, and in the fantasies which filled her imagination, There was nothing disagreeable or painful. On the contrary, it was joyous, burning excitement. Toward morning Anna dozed as she sat in her armchair, and when she awoke it was broad daylight, and the train was approaching Petersburg. Instantly the thought of her home, her husband, her son, and all the labors of the day and the coming days filled her mind. The train had hardly reached the station at Petersburg when Anna stepped out on the platform, and the first person that she saw was her husband waiting for her. "Oh, good heavens! Why do his ears stand out so?" she thought, as she looked at his reserved and portly figure, and especially at his stiff cartilaginous ears, which, as they propped out the rim of his round hat, struck her for the first time. When he saw her, he came to meet her at the carriage, compressing his lips into his habitual smile of irony, looking straight at her with his great weary eyes. A disagreeable thought made her heart sink when she saw his stubborn, weary look. She felt that she had expected to find him different. Especially was she astonished by the feeling of self-dissatisfaction which she experienced on meeting him. This feeling was associated with her home, akin to the state of hypocrisy which she recognized in her relations with her husband. This feeling was not novel. She had felt it before without heeding it, but now she realized it clearly and painfully. "There, you see, I'm a tender husband, tender as the first year of our marriage. I was burning with desire to see you," said he, in his slow, deliberate voice, and with the light tone of raillery that he generally used in speaking to her, a tone of ridicule of any one who should really say such things. "Is Serosa well?" she asked. "And is this all the reward," he said, "for my ardor?" "He is well, very well." End of chapter 30. Part 1, Chapter 31 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Vronsky also had not even attempted to sleep all that night. He sat in his armchair, now gazing straight forward, now looking at those who came in and went out, and if before he had impressed strangers and irritated them by his imperturbable dignity, now he would have seemed to them far more haughty and self-contained. He looked at men as if they were things. A nervous young man, employed in the district court, was sitting opposite him in the carriage, and came to hate him on account of this aspect. The young man asked for a light, and spoke to him, and even touched him, in order to make him perceive that he was not a thing but a man. Yet Vronsky looked at him exactly as he looked at the carriage lamp. And the young man made a grimace, feeling that he should lose command of himself to be so scorned by a man. Vronsky saw nothing, saw no one. He felt as if he were a Tsar, not because he believed that he had made an impression upon Anna, he did not fully realize that, as yet, but because the impression which she had made on him filled him with happiness and pride. What would be the outcome of all this he did not know, and did not even consider, but he felt that all his hitherto dissipated and scattered powers were now concentrating and converging with frightful rapidity toward one beatific focus. And he was happy in this thought. He knew only that he had told her the truth when he said he was going where she was, that all the happiness of life, the sole significance of life, he found now in seeing and hearing her. And when he left his compartment at Bologovo to get a glass of seltzer, and he saw Anna, involuntarily his first word told her what he thought. And he was glad that he had spoken as he did, glad that she knew all now, and was thinking about it. He did not sleep all night. Returning to his carriage, he did not cease recalling all his memories of her, the words that she had spoken, and in his imagination glowed the pictures of a possible future which overwhelmed his heart. When, on reaching Petersburg, he left the carriage, after his sleepless night, he felt as fresh and vigorous as if he had just had a cold bath. He stood near his carriage, waiting to see her pass. "Once more I shall see her," he said to himself with a smile. "I shall see her graceful bearing, her face. She will speak a word to me, will turn her head, will look at me. Perhaps she will smile on me. But it was her husband whom first he saw, politely escorted through the crowd by the station master. Oh, yes, the husband. And then Vronsky for the first time clearly realized that the husband was an important factor in Anna's life. He knew that she had a husband, but he had not realized his existence, and he now fully realized it only as he saw his head and shoulders, and his legs clothed in black trousers, and especially when he saw this husband unconcernedly take her hand with an air of proprietorship. When he saw Alexey Alexandrovitch, with his Petersburgish fresh face, and his solid, self-confident figure, his round hat, his slightly stooping shoulders, he began to believe in his existence, and he experienced an unpleasant sensation, such as a man tormented by thirst might experience, who should discover a fountain, but find that a dog, a sheep, or a pig has been drinking and fouling the water. Alexey Alexandrovitch's stiff and heavy gait was exceedingly distasteful to Vronsky. He would not acknowledge that anyone besides himself had the right to love Anna. But she was still the same, and the sight of her had still the same effect on him, physically kindling him, stirring him, and filling his heart with joy. He ordered his German body servant, who came hurrying up to him from the second-class carriage, to see to the baggage and to go home, and he himself went to her. Thus he witnessed the first meeting between husband and wife, and with a lover's intuition perceived the shade of constraint with which Anna spoke to her husband. No, she does not love him, and she cannot love him, was his mental judgment. Even as he came up to Anna Arkadyevna from behind, he noticed with joy that she felt him near her and looked round, and having recognized him, she went on talking with her husband. "Did you pass a good night?" he inquired, bowing to her and her husband, and allowing Alexey Alexandrovitch the opportunity to accept the honor of the salutation, and recognize him, or not recognize him, as it might seem good to him. "Thank you, very good," she replied. Her face expressed weariness, lacked that spark of animation which was generally hovering now in her eyes, now in her smile. But, for a single instant, at the sight of Vronsky, something flashed into her eyes, and, notwithstanding the fact that the fire instantly died away, he was overjoyed even at this. She raised her eyes to her husband, to see whether he knew Vronsky. Alexey Alexandrovitch looked at him with displeasure, vaguely remembering who he was. Vronsky's calm self-assurance struck upon Alexey Alexandrovitch's cool superciliousness as a scythe strikes a rock. "Count Vronsky," said Anna. "Ah, we have met before, it seems to me," said Alexey Alexandrovitch with indifference, extending his hand. "Went with the mother and came home with the son," said he, speaking with precision, as if his words were worth a ruble apiece. "I presume you are returning from a furlough?" And without waiting for an answer, he turned to his wife, in his ironical tone. "Did they shed many tears at Moscow on your leaving them?" By thus addressing his wife he intended to give Vronsky to understand that he desired to be left alone, and again bowing to him, he touched his hat. But Vronsky had one more word to say to Anna. "I hope I have the honor of calling on you," said he. Alexey Alexandrovitch, with weary eyes, looked at Vronsky. "Very happy," he said coldly. "We receive on Mondays." Then, leaving Vronsky entirely, he said to his wife, still in a jesting tone, "And how fortunate that I happen to have a spare half-hour to come to meet you and show you my affection." "You emphasize your affection too much for me to appreciate it," she replied, in the same spirit of raillery, involuntarily listening to Vronsky's steps behind them. "But what is that to me?" she asked herself in thought. Then she began to ask her husband how Serosa had got along during her absence. "Oh, excellently. Mariette says that he has been very good, and I am sorry to mortify you. He did not seem to miss you, not so much as your husband did. But again, merci, my dear, that you came a day earlier. Our dear samovar will be delighted." He called the celebrated Countess Lidia Ivanovna by the nickname Samovar, because, like a tea-urn, she was always and everywhere bubbling and boiling. She has kept asking after you, and do you know, if I make bold to advise you, you would do well to go see her to-day. You see, her heart is always sore about something. At present, besides her usual cares, she is greatly concerned about the reconciliation of Yablonskys." The Countess Lidia Ivanovna was a friend of Anna's husband, and the centre of a certain clique in Petersburg society, to which Anna on her husband's account, rather than for any other reason, belonged. "Yes, but didn't I write her?" "She must have all the details. Go to her, my love, if you are not too tired. Well, Kondraty will call your carriage, and I am going to a committee meeting. I shall not have to dine alone to-day," continued Alexey Alexandrovitch, not in jest this time. "You cannot imagine how used I am to—" And with a peculiar smile, giving her a long pressure of the hand, he conducted her to the carriage. Chapter 32. Of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. The first person to meet Anna when she reached home was her son. He darted downstairs, in spite of his governess's reproof, and with a wild delight called, "Mamma! Mamma!" Rushing up to her, he threw his arms around her neck. "I told you it was mamma!" he shouted to the governess. "I knew it was!" But the son, no less than the husband, awakened in Anna a feeling of disillusion. She imagined him better than he was in reality. She was obliged to descend to the reality in order to look on him as he was. But in fact he was lovely, with his fair curls, his blue eyes, and his pretty plump legs in their neatly fitting stockings. She felt an almost physical satisfaction in feeling him near her, and in his caresses, and a moral calm in looking into his tender, confiding, loving eyes, and in hearing his innocent questions. She unpacked the gifts sent him by Dolly's children, and told him how there was a little girl in Moscow named Tanya, and how this Tanya knew how to read, and was teaching the other children to read. "Am I not as good as she?" asked Serosa. "For me, you are worth all the rest of the world." "I know it," said Serosa, smiling. Anna had not finished drinking her coffee when the Countess Lidia Ivanovna was announced. The Countess Lidia Ivanovna was a tall, stout woman with an unhealthy, sallow complexion, and handsome, dreamy black eyes. Anna liked her, but to-day, as if for the first time, she saw her with all her faults. "Well, my dear, did you carry the olive branch?" demanded the Countess Lidia Ivanovna as she entered the room. "Yes, it is all made up," replied Anna, "but it was not so bad as we thought. As a general thing, my sister-in-law is too peremptory." But the Countess Lidia, who was interested in everything that did not specially concern herself, had the habit of sometimes not heeding what did not interest her. She interrupted Anna. "Well, this world is full of woes and tribulations, and I am all worn out to-day." "What is it?" asked Anna, striving to repress a smile. "I am beginning to weary of the ineffectual attempts to get at the truth, and sometimes I am utterly discouraged. The work of the Little Sisters," this was a philanthropic and religiously patriotic institution, "used to get along splendidly, but there is nothing to be done with these men," added the Countess Lidia Ivanovna, with an air of ironical resignation to fate. "They got hold of the idea, they mutilated it, and then they judge it so meanly, so wretchedly. 2 or 3 men, your husband among them, understand all the significance of this work, but the others only discredit it. Yesterday I had a letter from Pravdin." Pravdin was a famous Panslavist who lived abroad, and the Countess Lidia Ivanovna related what he had said in his letter. Then she went on to describe the troubles and snares that blocked the work of uniting the churches, and finally departed in haste, because it was the day for her to be present at the meeting of some society or other, and at the sitting of the Slavonic Committee. "All this is just as it has been, but why did I never notice it before?" said Anna to herself. "Was she very irritable to-day?" but at any rate it is ridiculous. Her aims are charitable. She is a Christian, and yet she is angry with everyone, and everyone is her enemy. And yet all her enemies are working for Christianity and charity. After the departure of the Countess Lidia Ivanovna came a friend, the wife of a director, who told her all the news of the city. At 3 o'clock she went out, promising to be back in time for dinner. Alexey Alexandrovitch was at the meeting of the ministry. The hour before dinner, which Anna spent alone, she employed sitting with her son, who had his dinner by himself, in arranging her things, and in reading and answering the letters and notes heaped up on her writing table. The sense of causeless shame, and the agitation from which she had suffered so strangely during her journey, now completely disappeared. Under the conditions of her ordinary everyday life she felt calm and free from reproach, and she was filled with wonder as she recalled her condition of the night before. What was it? Nothing. Vronsky said a foolish thing. It is easy to put an end to such nonsense, and I answered him exactly right. To speak of it to my husband is unnecessary and impossible. To speak about it would seem to attach importance to what has none. And she recalled how, when a young subordinate of her husband's in Petersburg had almost made her a declaration, and she had told him about it, Alexey Alexandrovitch answered that as she went into society, she, like all society women, might expect such experiences, but that he had perfect confidence in her tact, and never would permit himself to humiliate her or him by jealousy. Why tell then? Besides, thank God, there is nothing to tell. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Alexey Alexandrovitch returned from the ministry about 4 o'clock, but as often happened, he found no time to speak to Anna. He went directly to his private room to give audience to some petitioners who were waiting for him, and to sign some papers brought him by his chief secretary. The Karenins always had at least 3 visitors to dine with them, and that day there came an old lady, a cousin of Alexey Alexandrovitch's, a department director with his wife, and a young man recommended to Alexey Alexandrovitch for employment. Anna came to the drawing room to receive them at 5 o'clock precisely. The great bronze clock, of the time of Peter the Great, had not yet finished its 5th stroke when Alexey Alexandrovitch, in white cravat and with 2 decorations on his dress coat, left his dressing room. He had an engagement immediately after dinner. Every moment of Alexey Alexandrovitch's life was counted and occupied, and in order to accomplish what he had to do every day, he was forced to use the strictest punctuality. Without haste and without rest was his motto. He entered the dining room, bowed to his guests, and, giving his wife a smile, hastily sat down. "Yes, my solitude is over. You can't believe how irksome," he laid a special stress on the word nelovko, irksome, "it is to dine alone." During the dinner he talked with his wife about matters in Moscow, and, with his mocking smile, inquired especially about Stepan Arkadyevitch. But the conversation dwelt for the most part on common subjects, about official and social matters in Petersburg. After dinner he spent a half hour with his guests, and then, giving his wife another smile, and pressing her hand, he left the room and went to the council. Anna did not go out that evening, either to the Princess Betsy Tverskaya's, who, having heard of her arrival, had sent her an invitation, or to the theatre, where she just now had a box. She did not go out principally because the gown on which she had counted was not finished. After the departure of her guests, Anna took a general survey of her wardrobe, and was very angry. She was extremely clever in dressing at small expense, and just before she went to Moscow she had given 3 gowns to her dressmaker to make over. These gowns required to be made over in such a way that no one would recognize them, and they should have been ready 3 days before. 2 of the gowns proved to be absolutely unfinished, and one was not made over in a way which Anna liked. The dressmaker sought to explain what she had done, declaring that her way was best, and Anna reprimanded her so severely that afterwards she felt ashamed of herself. To calm her agitation, she went to the nursery and spent the whole evening with her son, put him to bed herself, made the sign of the cross over him, and tucked the quilt about him. She was glad that she had not gone out, and that she had spent such a happy evening. It was so quiet and restful, and now she saw clearly that all that had seemed so important during her railway journey was only one of the ordinary insignificant events of social life, that she had nothing of which to be ashamed, either in her own eyes or in the eyes of others. She sat down in front of the fireplace with her English novel, and waited for her husband. About 10:30 exactly his ring was heard at the door, and he came into the room. "Here you are, at last," she said, giving him her hand. He kissed her hand, and sat down near her. "Your journey, I see, was on the whole very successful," said he. "Yes, very," she replied, and she began to relate all the details from the beginning, her journey with the Countess Vronskaya, her arrival, the accident at the station, the pity which she had felt, first for her brother, and afterwards for Dolly. "I do not see how it is possible to pardon such a man, even though he is your brother," said Alexey Alexandrovitch severely. Anna smiled. She appreciated that he said this to show that not even kinship could bend him from the strictness of his honest judgment. She knew this trait in her husband's character, and liked it. "I am glad that it ended so satisfactorily, and that you have come home again," he continued. "Well, what do they say there about the new measures that I introduced in the council?" Anna had heard nothing about this new measure, and she was confused because she had so easily forgotten something which to him was so important. "Here, on the contrary, it has made a great sensation," said he, with a self-satisfied smile. She saw that Alexey Alexandrovitch wanted to tell her something very flattering to himself about this affair, and, by means of questions, she led him up to the story. And he, with the same self-satisfied smile, began to tell her of the congratulations which he had received on account of this measure, which had been passed. "I was very, very glad. This proves that at last reasonable and serious views about this question are beginning to be formed among us." After he had taken his second glass of tea, with cream and bread, Alexey Alexandrovitch arose to go to his library. "But you did not go out? It was very tiresome for you?" he said. "Oh, no," she replied, rising with her husband, and going with him through the hall to the library. "What are you reading now?" she asked. "Just now I am reading the Duc de Lille, Poésie des Enfers," he replied. "A very remarkable book." Anna smiled, as one smiles at the weakness of those we love, and, passing her arm through her husband's, accompanied him to the library door. She knew that his habit of reading in the evening had become inexorable, and that, notwithstanding his absorbing duties, which took so much of his time at the council, he felt it his duty to follow all that seemed remarkable in the sphere of literature. She also knew that while he felt a special interest in works on political economy, philosophy, and religion, art was quite foreign to his nature. And notwithstanding this, or better, for that very reason, Alexey Alexandrovitch allowed nothing that was attracting attention in that field to escape his notice, but considered it his duty to read everything. She knew that in the province of political economy, philosophy, religion, Alexey Alexandrovitch had his doubts, and tried to solve them. But in questions of art or poetry, particularly in music, the comprehension of which was utterly beyond him, he had the most precise and definite opinions. He loved to talk of Shakespeare, Raphael, and Beethoven, of the importance of the new school of music and poetry, all of whom were classed by him according to the most rigorous logic. "Well, God be with you," she said, as they reached the door of the library. Near her husband's armchair were standing, as usual, the shade lamp already lighted, and a carafe with water. "And I'm going to write to Moscow." Again he pressed her hand and kissed it. "Taken all in all, he is a good man, upright, excellent, remarkable in his sphere," said Anna to herself, on her way to her room, as if she was defending him from some one who accused him of not being lovable. "But why do his ears stick out so? Or does he cut his hair too short?" It was just midnight, and Anna was still sitting at her writing table finishing a letter to Dolly, when measured steps and slippers were heard, and Alexey Alexandrovitch, who had washed his face and brushed his hair, came in with his book under his arm. "Late, late," he said with his usual smile, and passed on to his sleeping room. And what right had he to look at him so, thought Anna, recalling Vronsky's expression when he saw Alexey Alexandrovitch. Having undressed, she went to her room, but in her face there was none of the animation that shone in her eyes and in her smile at Moscow. On the contrary, the fire had either died away or was somewhere far away and out of sight. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. On leaving Petersburg, Vronsky had installed his beloved friend and comrade, Petritsky, in his ample quarters on the Morskaya. Petritsky was a young lieutenant, not particularly distinguished, and not only not rich, but over ears in debt. Every evening he came home tipsy, and he spent much of his time at the police courts, in search of strange, or amusing, or scandalous stories. But in spite of all, he was a favorite with his comrades and his chiefs. About 11 o'clock in the morning, when Vronsky reached his rooms after his journey, he saw at the entrance an Ivashchik's carriage, which he knew very well. From the door, when he rang, he heard men's laughter and the lisping of a woman's voice, and Petritsky shouting, "If it's any of those villains, don't let 'em in." Vronsky, not allowing his denshchik to announce his presence, quietly entered the anteroom. The Baroness Shilton, a friend of Petritsky's, shining in a lilac satin robe and with her little pink face, was making coffee before a round table, and, like a canary bird, was filling the room with her Parisian slang. Petritsky in his overcoat, and Captain Kamerovsky in full uniform, apparently just from duty, were sitting near her. "Bravo, Vronsky!" cried Petritsky, leaping up and overturning the chair. "The master himself! Baroness, coffee for him from the new coffee-pot. We did not expect you. I hope that you are pleased with the new ornament in your library," he said, pointing to the Baroness. "You are acquainted, aren't you?" "I should think so," said Vronsky, smiling gaily, and squeezing the Baroness's dainty little hand. "We're old friends." "Are you back from a journey?" asked the Baroness. "Then I'm off. Ach, I'm going this minute if I am in the way." "You are home wherever you are, Baroness," said Vronsky. "How are you, Kamerovsky?" coolly shaking hands with the captain. "There now, you would never think of saying such lovely things as that," said the Baroness to Petritsky. "No, why not? After dinner I could say better things." "Yes, after dinner there's no more merit in them. Well, I will make your coffee while you go and wash your hands and brush off the dust," said the Baroness, again sitting down and industriously turning the screw of the new coffee-pot. "Pierre, bring some more coffee," she said to Petritsky, whom she called Pierre after his family name, making no concealment of her intimacy with him. "I will add it." "You will spoil it." "No, I won't spoil it." "Well, and your wife?" said the Baroness, suddenly interrupting Vronsky's remarks to his companions. "We have been marrying you off. Did you bring your wife?" "No, Baroness. I was born a Bohemian, and I shall die a Bohemian." "So much the better. So much the better. Give us your hand." And the Baroness, without letting him go, began to talk with him, developing her various plans of life, and asking his advice with many jests. "He will never be willing to let me have a divorce. Well, what am I to do?" He was her husband. "I now mean to institute a lawsuit. What should you think of it? Kamerovsky, just watch the coffee. It's boiling over. You see how well I understand business. I mean to bring a lawsuit to get control of my fortune. Do you understand this nonsense? Under the pretext that I have been unfaithful," said she in a scornful tone, "he means to get possession of my estate." Vronsky listened with amusement to this gay prattle of the pretty woman, approved of what she said, gave her half-jesting advice, and assumed the tone he usually affected with women of her character. In his Petersburg world, humanity was divided into two absolutely distinct categories. The one of a low order, Trivial, stupid, and above all ridiculous people, who declare that one husband ought to live with one wedded wife, that girls should be virtuous, women chaste, men brave, temperate, and upright, occupied in bringing up their children decently, in earning their bread, and paying their debts, and other such absurdities. People of this kind were old-fashioned and ridiculous. But there was another and vastly superior class, to which he and his friends belonged, and in this the chief requirement was that its members should be elegant, generous, bold, gay, unblushingly given over to every passion, and scornful of all the rest. Only for the first moment was Vronsky bewildered under the impressions which he had brought back from Moscow, of an entirely different world. But soon, and as naturally as one puts off old slippers, he got into the spirit of his former gay and jovial life. The coffee was never served. It boiled over, spattered them all, and wet a costly tablecloth and the baroness's dress. But it served the end that was desired, for it gave rise to many jests and merry peals of laughter. "Well, now, good-bye, for you will never get dressed, and I shall have on my conscience the worst crime that a decent man can commit, that of not taking a bath. So you advise me to put the knife to his throat?" "By all means, and in such a way that your little hand will come near his lips. He will kiss your little hand, and all will end to everybody's satisfaction," said Vronsky. "This evening, at the Theatre Français," said she, and took her departure with her rustling train. Kamerovsky likewise arose, but Vronsky, without waiting for him to go, shook hands with him, and went to his dressing-room. While he was taking his bath, Petritsky sketched for him in a few lines his situation, and how it had changed during Vronsky's absence. No money at all, his father declaring that he would not give him any more, or pay a single debt. One tailor determined to have him arrested, and a second no less determined. His colonel insisted that, if these scoundrels continued, he should leave the regiment. The baroness was as annoying to him as a bitter radish, principally because she was always wanting to squander money. "But she is a daisy, a charmer," he assured Vronsky, in the strict Oriental style. "Your servant Rebecca, kind, you know." He had been having a quarrel with Berkoshef, and he wanted to send him his seconds, but he imagined nothing would come of it. As for the rest, everything was getting along particularly jolly. And then, without leaving Vronsky time to realize the minutiae of his situation, Petritsky began to retail the news of the day. As he listened to Petritsky's well-known gossip, in the familiar environment of his quarters where he had lived for 3 years, Vronsky experienced the pleasant sensation of his return to his gay and idle Petersburg life. "It cannot be," he cried, referring to the report that Laura had taken up with Malif and thrown Furtinghoff over. "And is he as stupid and as conceited as ever? Well, and how about Bazulukov?" "Ah, Bazulukov! Here's a good story, fascinating," said Petritsky. "You know his passion, balls, and he never misses one at court. At the last one he went in a new helmet. Have you seen the new helmets? Very handsome, light. Well, he was standing. No, but listen." "Yes, I am listening," replied Vronsky, rubbing his face with the towel. "The Grand Duchess was just going by on the arm of some foreign ambassador or other, and unfortunately for him their conversation turned on the new helmets. The Grand Duchess wanted to point out one of the new helmets, and, seeing our Golubchik standing there," here Petritsky showed him how he stood in his helmet, "she begged him to show her his helmet. He did not budge. What does it mean? The fellows wink at him, make signs, scowl at him. Give it to her. He does not stir. He is like a dead man. You can imagine the scene. Now, then they attempted to take it off. He won't let it go. At last he himself takes it off, and hands it to the Grand Duchess. 'Here, this is the new kind,' said the Grand Duchess, but as she turned it over, you can imagine it, out came, pears, bonbons, 2 pounds of bonbons. He had been to market, Golubchik." Vronsky burst out laughing, and long afterwards, even when speaking of other things, the memory of the unfortunate helmet caused him to break out into a good-natured laugh, which showed his handsome regular teeth. Having learned all the news, Vronsky donned his uniform with the aid of his valet, and went out to report himself. After he had reported, he determined to go to his brother's, to Betsy's, and to make a few calls, so as to secure an entry into the society where he should be likely to see Madame Karenina. And in accordance with the usual custom at Petersburg, he left his rooms, expecting to return only when it was very late at night. End of Chapter 34. An end of Part 1 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. Chapter 1 of Anna Karenina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. Part 2, Chapter 1. Toward the end of the winter, the Shtcherbatskys held a consultation of physicians in order to find out what was the state of Kitty's health, and what measures were to be taken to restore her strength. She was ill, and the approach of spring only increased her ailment. The family doctor had ordered cod liver oil, then iron, and last of all, nitrate of silver, but as none of these remedies did any good, and as he advised them to take her abroad, it was then resolved to consult a celebrated specialist. This celebrated doctor, still a young man, and very neat in his appearance, insisted on a careful investigation of the trouble. He with especial satisfaction, as it seemed, insisted that maidenly modesty is only a relic of barbarism, and that nothing is more natural than that a young man should make examination of a girl in undress. He found this natural because he did it every day, and he was conscious of no impropriety in it, as far as he could see, and, therefore, any sense of shame on the part of the girl he considered not only a relic of barbarism, but also an insult to himself. It was necessary to submit, since, notwithstanding the fact that all the other doctors were taught in the same school and studied the same books, and notwithstanding the fact that certain persons declared that this celebrated doctor was a bad doctor, yet in the princess's house and in her circle of friends it was admitted somehow that this celebrated doctor was the only one known who had the special knowledge, and was the only one who could save Kitty's life. After a careful examination and a prolonged thumping on the lungs of the poor sick girl, trembling with mortification, the celebrated physician carefully washed his hands, and returned to the drawing-room, and gave his report to the prince. The prince, with a little cough, listened to what he had to say, and frowned. He was a man of experience and brains, was in good health, and had no faith in medicine. He was all the more angry at this comedy, because possibly he alone understood what ailed his daughter. A regular humbug, thought the old prince, as he listened to the doctor's loquacity concerning the symptoms of his daughter's illness, mentally applying to the celebrated doctor a term from the vocabulary of hunting. The doctor, on his part, with difficulty disguised his disdain, with difficulty stooped to the low level of his intelligence, for this old gentleman. It seemed to him scarcely necessary to speak to the old man, since, in his eyes, the head of the house was the princess. He was ready to pour out before her all the floods of his eloquence. At this moment she came in with the family doctor. The prince left the room, so as not to show too clearly how ridiculous this whole comedy seemed to him. The princess was troubled, and did not know what course to take. She felt a little guilty in regard to Kitty. "Well, doctor, decide our fate," said the princess. "Tell me all." She wanted to say, "Is there any hope?" but her lips trembled, and she could not put the question to him. "Well, doctor?" "In a moment, princess, I shall be at your service, after I have conferred with my colleague. I shall then have the honor of giving you my opinion." "Do you wish to be alone?" "Just as you please." The princess sighed, and left the room. When the doctors were left alone, the family physician began timidly to express his opinion about her condition, and gave his reasons for thinking that it was the beginning of tubercular disease, but the celebrated physician listened, and in the midst of his diagnosis took out his great gold watch. "Yes," said he, "but The family physician stopped respectfully. "You know that we can hardly decide when tubercular disease first begins. In the present case apparently there is as yet no decided lesion. We can only surmise, and the symptoms are indigestion, nervousness, and others. The question, therefore, stands thus: what is to be done, granting that a tubercular development is to be feared, in order to superinduce improved alimentation?" "But you know well, in such cases there are always some moral or spiritual causes," said the family doctor, with a cunning smile. "Of course," replied the celebrated doctor, looking at his watch again. "Excuse me, but do you know whether the bridge over the Usa is finished yet, or whether one has to go around? Oh, it is finished, is it? Well, then I have 20 minutes left. We were just saying that the question remains thus: to improve the digestion and strengthen the nerves. The one is connected with the other, and it is necessary to act on both halves of the circle." "But the journey abroad?" "I am opposed to these journeys abroad. I beg you to follow my reasoning. If tubercular development has already set in, which we are not yet in a condition to prove, then a journey abroad would do no good. The main thing is to discover a means of promoting good digestion." And the celebrated doctor began to develop his plans for a cure by means of soda water, the principal merits of which were, in his eyes, their absolutely inoffensive character. The family doctor listened with attention and respect. "But I should urge in favour of a journey abroad the change of her habits and disassociation from the conditions that serve to recall unhappy thoughts. And finally, her mother wants her to go." "Ah, well, in that case let them go, provided always that those German charlatans do not aggravate her disease. They must follow. Yes, let them travel." And again he looked at his watch. "It is time for me to go," and he started for the door. The celebrated doctor explained to the princess that he wished to see the invalid once more. A sense of propriety dictated this. "What! Have another examination?" cried the princess with horror. "Oh, no, only a few minor points, princess." "Then come in, I beg of you." And the mother ushered the doctor into the drawing room where Kitty was. Emaciated and flushed, with a peculiar gleam in her eyes, the result of the mortification she had borne, Kitty was standing in the middle of the room. When the doctor came in her eyes filled with tears, and she turned crimson. Her whole illness and the medical treatment seemed to her such stupid, even ridiculous nonsense. The medical treatment of her case seemed to her as absurd as to gather up the fragments of a broken vase. Her heart was broken, and could it be healed by pills and powders? But it was impossible to wound her mother's feelings, the more because her mother felt that she had been to blame. "Will you sit down, princess?" said the celebrated doctor. With a smile he sat down in front of her, felt her pulse, and with a smile began a series of wearisome questions. At first she replied to them, then suddenly arose impatiently. "Excuse me, doctor, but, indeed, this all leads to nothing. This is the third time you have asked me the same question." The celebrated doctor took no offence. "It is her nervous irritability," he remarked to the princess when Kitty had gone from the room. "However, I had finished." And the celebrated doctor explained the young princess's condition to her mother, treating her as a woman of remarkable intelligence, and concluded with directions how to drink those waters which were valueless. On the question, "Is it best to take her abroad?" the doctor pondered deeply, as if he were deciding a difficult problem. The decision was at last expressed. "Go, but put no faith in the charlatans, and consult him in everything." After the doctor's departure, everyone felt as if something jolly had happened. The mother, in much better spirits, rejoined her daughter, and Kitty declared that she was better already. Often, almost all the time, of late, she had felt obliged to pretend. "Truly, I am well, maman, but if you desire it, let us go," she said, and in her endeavour to show that she was interested in the journey, she began to speak of their preparations. Chapter 2 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Shortly after the doctor went, Dolly came. She knew that the consultation was to take place that day, and though she was as yet scarcely able to go out, having had a little daughter toward the end of the winter, and although she had many trials and cares of her own, she left her nursing baby and one of the little girls who was ailing, and came to learn what Kitty's fate should be. "Well, how is it?" she said, as she came into the drawing room with her hat on. "You are all happy? Then all is well?" They endeavoured to tell her what the doctor had said; but it seemed that, although the doctor had spoken very fluently and lengthily, no one was able to tell what he had said. The only interesting point was the decision in regard to the journey abroad. Dolly sighed involuntarily. Her sister, her best friend, was going away, and life for her was not joyous. Her relations with Stepan Arkadyevitch since the reconciliation had become humiliating. The union brought about by Anna had not been of long duration, and the family concord had broken down in the same place. There was nothing definite, but Stepan Arkadyevitch was scarcely ever at home. There was scarcely ever any money in the house, and suspicions of his unfaithfulness constantly tormented Dolly. But she kept driving them away in terror of the unhappiness which jealousy caused her. The first explosion of jealousy, having been lived down, could not indeed be experienced again, and even the discovery of his unfaithfulness could not have such an effect on her as it had the first time. Such a discovery now would only break up the family, and she preferred to shut her eyes to his deception, despising him, and above all herself, because of this weakness. Moreover, the cares of a numerous family constantly annoyed her. First the nursing of her baby was unsatisfactory, then the nurse went off, and now one of the children was ill. "And how are the children?" asked the princess. "Ach, maman, we have so many tribulations. Lily is ill in bed, and I'm afraid it is the scarlatina. I came out now to see how you were, for there'll be no getting out for me after this, if it is the scarlatina, which God forbid." The old prince also, after the doctor's departure, came out from his library, presented his cheek to Dolly, exchanged a few words with her, and then turned to his wife. "What decision have you come to? Shall you go? Well, and what are you going to do with me?" "I think, Alexander, that you had better stay at home." "Just as you please." "Maman, why doesn't papa come with us?" said Kitty. "It would be gayer for him and for us." The old prince got up and smoothed Kitty's hair with his hand. She raised her head, and with an effort smiled as she looked at him. It always seemed to her that he understood her better than any one else in the family, though he did not say much. She was the youngest, and therefore her father's favourite daughter, and it seemed to her that his love made him clairvoyant. When she saw his kind blue eyes steadily fixed on her, it seemed to her that he read her very soul, and saw all the evil that was working there. She blushed, and bent toward him, expecting a kiss, but he only pulled her hair, saying, "These stupid chignons! One never gets down to the real daughter, but you caress the hair of departed females. Well, Dolinka," turning to his eldest daughter, "what is that trump of yours doing?" "Nothing, papa," said Dolly, perceiving that her father referred to her husband. "He is always away from home, and I scarcely ever see him," she could not refrain from adding with an ironical smile. "Has he not gone yet to the country to sell his wood?" "No, he is always putting it off." "Truly," said the old prince, "is he taking after me?" "I hear you," he said in reply to his wife, and sitting down. "And as for you, Katya," he said, addressing his youngest daughter, "do you know what you ought to do? Sometime, some fine morning, wake up and say, 'There, I am perfectly well and happy, papa, and we must go for our early morning walk in the cold,' ha?" What her father said seemed very simple, but at his words Kitty felt confused and disconcerted, like a convicted criminal. "Yes, he knows all, he understands all, and these words mean that I ought to overcome my humiliation, however great it has been." She could not summon up the courage to reply. She began to say something, but suddenly burst into tears and ran from the room. "Just like your tricks," said the princess to her husband angrily. "You always—" and she began one of her tirades. The prince listened for some time to her reproaches, and made no reply, but his face kept growing darker and darker. "She is so sensitive, poor little thing, so sensitive, and you don't understand how she suffers at the slightest allusion to the cause of her suffering. Ah, how mistaken we are in people!" said the princess. And by the change in the inflection of her voice Dolly and the prince perceived that she had reference to Vronsky. "I don't understand why there are not any laws to punish such vile, such ignoble men." "Ah, do hear her," said the prince with a frown, getting up from his chair and evidently anxious to make his escape, but halting on the threshold. "There are laws, Matushka, and if you force me to this, I will tell you who is to blame in all this trouble. You alone. There are laws against such young fops, and there always will be. And if things had not been as they ought never to have been, old man that I am, I should have put that dandy on the fence. Yes, and now to cure her, you bring in these quacks." The prince would have had still more to say, but as soon as the princess heard his tone she immediately became humble and repentant, as always happened when important questions came up. "Alexander, Alexander," she murmured, going up to him and weeping. The prince held his peace when he saw her tears. He went to meet her. "Well, let it go, let it go. I know that it is hard for you also. What is to be done? There is no great harm. God is merciful. Thank you," said he, not knowing what he said, and replying to the princess's damp kiss which he felt on his hand. Then the prince left the room. As soon as Kitty, weeping, had left the room, Dolly, with her maternal domestic instinct, perceived that this was an affair which required a woman's management, and she was preparing to follow her. She took her hat, and morally tucking up her sleeves, prepared to act. But when her mother began to attack her father, she tried to restrain her, as far as her filial respect allowed. When the prince's outburst occurred, she said nothing. She was ashamed for her mother, and she felt a deep affection because of the instant return of his good nature. But when he went out, she determined to do the chief thing that was necessary, to go to Kitty and calm her. "I have long wanted to tell you, maman. Did you know that when Levin was here the last time, he intended to offer himself to Kitty? He told Stiva." "What is that? I do not understand." "Then perhaps Kitty refused him. Didn't she tell you?" "No, she did not say anything to me about either of them. She is too proud. But I know that all of this comes from—" "Yes, but think, if she refused Levin, I know that she would not have done so if it had not been for the other one, and then he deceived her so abominably." It was terrible to the princess to think how blameworthy she had been toward her daughter, and she grew angry. "Ach, I do not know anything about it. Nowadays every girl wants to live as she pleases, and not to say anything to her mother, and so it comes that—" "Maman, I am going to see her." "Go, I will not prevent you," said her mother. Chapter 2. Of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. As she entered Kitty's pretty little rosy boudoir, with figurines in vieux saxe, a room as youthful, as rosy, as gay as Kitty herself had been 2 months before, Dolly remembered with what pleasure and interest the two had decorated it the year before. How happy and gay they were then! She felt a chill at her heart as she saw her sister sitting on a low chair near the door, her motionless eyes fixed on a corner of the carpet. Kitty glanced up at her sister, but the cold and rather stern expression of her face underwent no change. "I am going now, and I may be confined at home, and it will be impossible for you to see me," said Darya Alexandrovna, sitting down near her sister. "I wanted to have a little talk with you." "What about?" asked Kitty, quickly raising her head in alarm. "What else than about your sorrow?" "I have no sorrow." "That'll do, Kitty. Do you really imagine that I don't know? I know everything, and believe me, this is such a trifle. All of us have been through this." Kitty said nothing, and her face resumed its severe expression. "He is not worth the trouble that you have given yourself because of him," continued Darya Alexandrovna, coming right to the point. "Yes, because he jilted me," murmured Kitty with trembling voice. Don't speak of it, please don't speak of it." "But who said that to you? No one said such a thing. I am sure that he was in love with you, that he is still in love with you, but—" "Ah, nothing exasperates me so as compassion!" cried Kitty in a sudden rage. She turned around in her chair, flushed scarlet, and moved her belt buckle back and forth from one hand to the other, clutching it in her fingers. Dolly well knew this habit of her sister when she was provoked. She knew that she was capable of forgetting herself and saying harsh and cruel things in moments of petulance, and she tried to calm her, but it was too late. "What do you wish me to understand? What is it?" cried Kitty, talking fast. "That I was in love with a man who did not care for me, and that I am dying of love for him? And it is my sister who says this to me, my sister who thinks that she is showing me her sympathy. I hate such sympathy and such hypocrisy." "Kitty, you are unjust." "Why do you torment me?" "Why, on the contrary, I saw you were sad." Kitty, in her anger, did not heed her. "I have nothing to break my heart over, and need no consolation. I am too proud to ever love a man who does not love me." "Well, I do not say. I say only one thing. Tell me the truth," added Darya Alexandrovna, taking her hand. "Tell me, did Levin speak to you?" At the name of Levin, Kitty lost all control of herself. She sprang up from her chair, threw the buckle on the floor, and with quick, indignant gestures cried: "Why do you speak to me of Levin? I don't see why you need to torment me. I have already said, and I repeat it, that I am proud, and never, never would I do what you have done, go back to a man who had been false to me, who had made love to another woman. I do not understand this. You can, but I cannot." As she said these words, she looked at her sister, and seeing that Dolly bent her head sadly without answering, she sat down near the door again, and hid her face in her handkerchief instead of leaving the room as she had intended to do. The silence lasted several minutes. Dolly was thinking of herself. Her humiliation, of which she was always conscious, appeared to her more cruel than ever, thus recalled by her sister. She did not expect such bitterness from her sister, and it made her angry. But suddenly she heard the rustling of a dress, a broken sob, and some one's arms were thrown around her neck. Kitty was on her knees before her. "Dolinka, I am so unhappy," she murmured in exculpation, and her pretty face, wet with tears, was hid in Dolly's skirt. Those tears were evidently the indispensable lubricant without which the machinery of mutual communion between the two sisters could not work. At all events, after a good cry, they spoke no more on the subject which interested them both, but even while they were talking about irrelevant topics, they understood each other. Kitty knew that the cruel words that she had uttered in her anger about the husband's unfaithfulness, the unfaithfulness of Dolly's husband, and her humiliation, struck deep into her poor sister's heart, but that she forgave her. Dolly, on her side, knew all that she wanted to know. She was convinced that her suspicions were correct, that the pain Kitty felt, the irremediable pain, lay in the fact that Levin had offered himself to her, and that she had refused him, and that Vronsky had played her false, and that she was ready to love Levin and to hate Vronsky. Kitty said not a word about this. She spoke only of the general state of her soul. "I have no sorrow," she said, regaining her calmness a little. "But you cannot imagine how wretched, disgusting, and vulgar everything seems to me, above all myself. You cannot imagine what evil thoughts come into my mind." "Yes, but what evil thoughts can you have?" asked Dolly with a smile. "The most abominable, the most repulsive. I cannot describe them to you. It is not melancholy, and it is not ennui. It is much worse. It is as if all the good that was in me had disappeared, and only the evil was left. Now how can that be, I tell you?" she asked, looking in perplexity into her sister's eyes. "Papa began to say something to me a few minutes ago. It seems to me he thinks that all I need is a husband. Mamma takes me to the ball. It seems to me that she takes me there for the sole purpose of getting rid of me, of getting me married as soon as possible. I know that it is not true, and yet I cannot drive away these ideas. So called marriageable young men are unendurable to me. It always seemed to me that they are taking my measure. A short time ago, to go anywhere in a ball gown was a simple delight to me. I admired myself. I enjoyed it. Now it is a bore to me, and I feel ill at ease. Now, what do you think? The doctor? Well—" Kitty stopped. She wanted to say further that, since she had felt this great change in herself, Stepan Arkadyevitch had become unendurably distasteful to her, that she could not see him without the most repulsive and unbecoming conjectures arising in her mind. "Indeed, everything takes the most repulsive, disgusting aspect in my sight," she continued. "It is a disease. Perhaps it will pass away. But don't for a moment think. I cannot help it. I do not feel at ease except with you and the children. What a pity that you can't come home with me now." "Well, I will go. I've had scarlatina. I will persuade maman." Kitty insisted so eagerly that she was allowed to go to her sister's, and throughout the course of the disease, which proved to be the scarlatina, she looked after the children. The two sisters successfully nursed all the 6 children, but Kitty's health did not improve, and at Lent the Shtcherbatskys went abroad. Chapter 4 Part 2, Chapter 4 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. The highest Petersburg society is remarkably united. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone exchanges visits. But in this great circle there are subdivisions. Anna Arkadyevna Karenina had friends and close relations with 3 different circles. One was the official circle, to which her husband belonged, composed of his colleagues and subordinates, bound together, or even further subdivided, by the most varied and often the most capricious social relations. It was now difficult for Anna to call back the sentiment of almost religious respect which at first she felt for all these personages. Now she knew them all, as one knows people in a provincial city. She knew what habits and weaknesses were characteristic of each, and what feet the shoe pinched. She knew what were their relations among themselves and to the official centre. She knew how this one agreed with that and on what grounds, and how another disagreed with still another and wherefore. But this administrative clique, to which her husband belonged, could never interest her, in spite of the Countess Lidia Ivanovna's suggestions, and she avoided it. The second circle in which Anna moved was that which had helped Alexey Alexandrovitch in his career. The centre of this circle was the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. It was composed of aged, ugly, charitable and devout women, and intelligent, learned and ambitious men. One of the cleverer men who belonged to this circle had called it the conscience of Petersburg society. Karenin was very much devoted to this circle, and Anna, who had the faculty of getting along with all people, had, during the early days of her life in Petersburg, made friends in its number. After her return from Moscow, this set of people seemed to her insupportable. It seemed as if she herself, as well as all the rest of them, were hypocritical, and she felt depressed and ill at ease in this society. She saw the Countess Lidia as infrequently as she possibly could. Finally, the third circle in which Anna had connections was society. Properly speaking, the fashionable society of balls, dinner parties, brilliant toilets, the society with which one hand lays fast hold of the court lest it descend to the level of the demi-mode, which the members of this circle affect to despise, and yet whose tastes are not only similar, but the same. The bond that united her to this society was the Princess Betsy Tverskaya, the wife of one of her cousins, who enjoyed an income of 120,000 roubles, and who had taken a great fancy to Anna as soon as she came to Petersburg, flattered her, introduced her among her friends, and made ridicule of the Countess Lidia's friends. "When I'm old and ugly I will do the same," said Betsy, "but a young and pretty woman like yourself has as yet no place in such an asylum." Anna had at first avoided as far as possible the society to which the Princess Betsy Tverskaya belonged, as it called for expenses beyond her means, and in her heart she preferred the first mentioned courtier. But after her visit to Moscow all this was changed. She neglected her worthy old friends, and cared to go only into grand society. There she met Vronsky, and experienced tumultuous pleasure in these meetings. They met with especial frequency at the house of Betsy, who was a Vronskaya before her marriage, and was an old cousin of the count. Vronsky went everywhere that he was likely to meet Anna, and if possible, spoke to her of his love. She gave him no encouragement, but every time she met him there flamed up in her soul the same sense of animation which had seized her the moment that they met, for the first time, on the train at Moscow. She herself was conscious that at the sight of him this joy shone in her eyes, in her smile, but she had not the power to hide it. Anna at first sincerely believed that she was angry because he persisted in following her, but one evening, not long after her return from Moscow, when she was present at a house where she expected to meet him, and he failed to come, she perceived clearly, by the pang that went through her heart, that she was deceiving herself, that this insistence of his not only was not disagreeable to her, but that it formed the ruling passion of her life. A famous diva was singing for the second time, and all the high society of Petersburg was at the theatre. Vronsky, from his seat in the front row, saw his cousin there, and without waiting for the entr'acte, left to visit her box. "Why didn't you come to dinner?" she asked, and then with a smile she added, so as to be heard only by him, "I admire this clairvoyance of lovers. She was not there. But come to my house after the opera." Vronsky looked at her questioningly. She nodded. He thanked her with a smile, and sat down by her side. "But how I miss your pleasantries! What has become of them?" continued the Princess Betsy, who followed with keen pleasure the progress of this passion. "You are in the toils, my dear." "That is all that I ask for," he replied with his calm good-natured smile, "to be in the toils. If I complain it is not because I am too little in the toils, if the truth must be told. I am beginning to lose hope." "What hope could you have?" asked Betsy, taking the part of her friend. "Let us have a clear understanding." But the fire in her eyes told with sufficient clearness that she understood as well as he did what his hope meant. "None," replied Vronsky, laughing, and showing his regular white teeth. "Excuse me," he added, taking the opera glasses from his cousin's hand, in order to direct it across her bare shoulder at one of the opposite boxes. "I fear I am becoming ridiculous." He knew very well that in Betsy's eyes, and in those of her world, he ran no risk of being ridiculous. He knew very well that in the eyes of such people, the rôle of an unsuccessful lover of a young girl or an unmarried woman might be ridiculous, but not so the rôle of a man who pursues a married woman, and at any price makes it his aim to lead her into committing adultery. This rôle is something beautiful and majestic, and can never be ridiculous, and therefore Vronsky, as he handed back the opera glasses, looked at his cousin with a smile of pride and joy lurking under his moustache. "And why didn't you come to dinner?" she asked again, unable to refrain from admiration of him. "I must tell you, I was busy. And what about? I will give you one guess out of 100, out of 1,000, and you will never hit it. I have been reconciling a husband with his wife's persecutor. Yes, fact." "What, and you reconciled them?" "Pretty nearly." "You must tell me all about it," said Betsy, rising. "Come during the next entr'acte." "Impossible. I am going to the French theatre." "From Nilsson?" said Betsy with horror, though she could not have distinguished Nilsson from the poorest chorus singer. "But what can I do? I have made an appointment in order to finish my act of peacemaking." "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be saved," said Betsy, remembering that she had heard somewhere some such quotation. "Well, then, sit down and tell me all about it." And she resumed her seat. Chapter 5 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. "It's a little improper, but so amusing, that I wanted awfully to tell you about it," said Vronsky, looking at her with sparkling eyes. "However, I will not mention any names." But I can guess. So much the better." "Listen, then. 2 gay young men were dining." "Officers of your regiment, of course." "I did not say that they were officers, but simply young men who had dined well." "Translated, tipsy." "Possibly. They went to dine with a comrade in most excellent spirits. They saw a pretty young woman passing them in a hired carriage. She turns around and, as it seems to them, nods to them and laughs. Of course they follow her. They gallop like mad. To their amazement their beauty stops at the entrance of the very house where they are going. She mounts to the upper floor, and they see nothing but a pair of rosy lips under a short veil, and a pair of pretty little feet." "You describe the scene with so much feeling that you make me believe that you were in the party." "Why do you accuse me so soon? Well, the 2 young men climb up to their comrade's room, where there is to be a farewell dinner, and there they drink, perhaps more than is good for them, as is usually the case at farewell dinners. And at dinner they ask who lives on the top story of the house. No one knows anything about it. Only their friend's valet, to their questions, 'Do any mamsells live on the top floor?' replies that there are a good many. After dinner the 2 young men go into their friend's library and write a letter to the unknown. They write a passionate letter, a declaration. They themselves carry up the letter, in order to explain whatever in the letter might not be perfectly understood." "But why do you tell me such horrible things? Well?" "They ring. A girl comes to the door. They give her the letter, telling her that they are so desperately in love that they are ready to die, there at the door. The girl is in doubt, and parleys with them. Suddenly a gentleman appears, red as a lobster, and with side whiskers like sausages, declares that there is no one there except his wife, and unceremoniously puts them out of the door." "How did you know that his side whiskers were like sausages?" "But now listen. I have just made peace between them." "Well, what came of it?" "This is the most interesting part of the affair. The happy couple prove to be a titular consular and his wife. The titular consular brings a complaint, and I am obliged to serve as peacemaker. What a peacemaker! I assure you Talleyrand compared to me was nobody." "What were your difficulties?" "Here now, listen. We make excuses as in duty bound, as 'We are desperately sorry,' we said. 'We beg you to pardon us for this unfortunate misunderstanding.' The titular consular with the sausage whiskers seemed to be thawing, but he felt it necessary to express his feelings, and as soon as he began to express his feelings he began to get wrathy and to say harsh things, and again I was obliged to bring all my diplomatic talents into requisition. I agree that their conduct was reprehensible, but please take into consideration that there was a misunderstanding. They were young and had just come from a good dinner. You understand. Now they are sorry from the bottom of their hearts, and beg you to forgive them their fault." The titular consular was softened still more. "I agree with you, Count, and I am ready to pardon them, but you perceive that my wife, a virtuous woman, has been exposed to insult, to persecution, and to the impudence of a good-for-nothing young and the impudent good-for-nothing young fellows being present, I had to exert myself to calm them down. Again I put my diplomacy to work, and every time I seem on the point of success my titular counsellor gets wrathy again, and his face gets red, and his sausages begin to wag up and down, and I find myself drowned in the waves of diplomatic subtleties." "Ah, we must tell you all about this," said Betsy to a lady who at that moment came into her box. "It has amused me so much. Well, good luck go with you," she added, giving Vronsky one of her fingers as she held her fan; and then, shrugging her shoulders so as to keep the waist of her gown from coming up, so that she might be as naked as possible when she should go to the front of the box, and sit down in the full blaze of gas and in the eyes of all. Vronsky went to the French theatre, where he really had to meet his regimental commander, who never failed to be present at a single representation. He wished to speak with him in regard to his business as peacemaker, which had occupied and amused him for 3 days. Petritsky, whom he liked, was involved in this affair, and the other one was a charming, a glorious fellow, young Prince Kurdov, who had lately joined their regiment. But the principal point was that the affair concerned the interests of his regiment. Both the young men belonged to Vronsky's company. Venden, the titular councillor, had come to the regimental commander with a complaint that the officers had insulted his wife. His young wife Venden said he had been married only half a year had been to church with her mother, and, feeling indisposed, owing to her delicate condition, so that she could not stand any longer, had engaged the first decent isvostchik at hand. The officers had chased her. She was frightened, and, feeling still more ill, had run up the stairs. Venden himself, who had just returned from his office, heard the sound of a bell and voices. He came out, and, seeing drunken officers with a letter, he had them put out. He demanded that they should be severely punished. "No, it's all very well to talk," said the regimental commander to Vronsky, whom he had asked to join him. "But Petritsky is becoming unbearable. Not a week passes without some scandal. This chinovnik will not stop here, he will go farther." Vronsky saw all the unpleasantness of this affair, and he felt that a duel should be avoided, and that everything should be done to make the titular councillor relent and smooth over the scandal. The regimental commander and Vronsky both realized that Vronsky's name and his Flügel adjutant's monogram ought to have a great effect in soothing the titular councillor. In reality these two influences proved partially efficacious, but the results of the reconciliation remained in doubt, as Vronsky said. When he reached the French theatre, Vronsky took the regimental commander into the lobby and told him of his success, or rather lack of success. After reflection the regimental commander decided to leave the matter in abeyance, but afterwards he began to question Vronsky regarding the details of the interview, and he could not help laughing as he heard Vronsky tell how the titular councillor kept suddenly flaming out in wrath as he recalled the particulars of the affair, and how Vronsky, veering round at the last mention of reconciliation, had withdrawn, pushing Petritsky before him, and his repeated attempts to bring him into a suitable frame of mind. "It is a wretched piece of business, but comical enough. Kirdov cannot fight with this gentleman. Was he so horribly angry?" he asked, laughing. "And how do you like Claire this evening? Charming," he said, referring to a new French actress. "One can't see her too often. She is always new. Only the French can do that." Chapter 6 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. The Princess Betsy left the theatre without waiting for the end of the last act. She had scarcely had more than time enough, after reaching home, to go into her dressing-room and scatter a little rice powder over her long, pale face, rearrange her toilet, and order tea to be served in the large drawing-room, when the carriages began one after another to arrive at her enormous house on the Bolshaya Morskaya. The guests came up to the wide entrance, and a portly Swiss, who during the morning read the newspaper for the edification of passers-by, as he sat behind the glass door, now kept noiselessly opening this great door and admitting the visitors. They came in by one door almost at the same instant that by another came the mistress of the mansion, with renewed color and hair rearranged. The walls of the great drawing-room were hung with sombre draperies, and on the floor were thick rugs. On the table, which was covered with a cloth of dazzling whiteness, shining in the light of numberless candles, stood a silver samovar and a tea-service of transparent porcelain. The princess took her place behind the samovar, and drew off her gloves. With the help of attentive servants, the guests brought up chairs and took their places, dividing into two camps, the one around the princess, and the other at the opposite end of the drawing-room around the wife of a foreign ambassador, a handsome lady dressed in black velvet and with black, well-defined eyebrows. The conversation, as usual at the beginning of a reception, was desultory, being interrupted by the arrival of newcomers, offers of tea, and the exchange of salutations, and seemed to be endeavoring to find a common subject of interest. "She is remarkably handsome for an actress. You can see that she has studied Kaulbach," said a diplomat in the group around the ambassador's wife. "Did you notice how she fell?" "Ach, please let us not speak of Nilsson. Nothing now can be said about her," said a great fat lady with a light complexion, without either eyebrows or chignon, and dressed in an old silk gown. This was the Princess MaryAnn, famous for her simplicity and frightful manners, and surnamed the Enfant Terrible. Princess MaryAnn was seated between the two groups, listening to what was said on both sides of her, and taking impartial interest in both. This very day 3 people have made that same remark about Kaulbach. It must be fashionable. I don't see why that phrase should be so successful." The conversation was cut short by this remark, and a new theme had to be started. "Tell us something amusing, but don't let it be naughty," said the ambassador's wife, who was a mistress of the art of conversation called, by the English, small talk. She was addressing the diplomatist, who was at a loss what topic to start. "They say this is very hard, that only naughty things are amusing," replied the diplomatist, with a smile. "However, I will do my best. Give me a theme. Everything depends upon the theme. When you get that for a background, you can easily fill it in with embroidery. I often think that the celebrated talkers of the past would be exceedingly embarrassed if they were so alive now. Everything intellectual is considered so dull." "That was said long ago," remarked the ambassador's wife, interrupting him with a smile. The conversation began amiably, and for the very reason that it was too amiable, it languished again. It was necessary to have recourse to an unfailing, never-changing subject, gossip. "Don't you think that there is something Louis XV about Tushkevitch?" asked he, indicating a handsome, light-haired young man who was standing near the table. "Oh, yes. He's quite in the style of the drawing-room, and that's why he is here so often." This subject sustained the conversation, since it consisted wholly of hints regarding something which could not be treated openly in that drawing-room, in other words, Tushkevitch's relations with the Princess Betsy. Around the samovar the conversation hesitated for some time upon 3 inevitable subjects: the news of the day, the theatre, and a lawsuit which was to be tried the next day. At last the same subject arose that was occupying the other group, gossip. "Have you heard that Maltischeva, that is the mother, not the daughter, has had a costume in Diable Rose?" "Is it possible? No. This is delicious." "I am astonished that with her sense, for she is certainly not stupid, she does not perceive how ridiculous she is." Every one found something in which to criticize and tear to pieces the unfortunate Madame Maltischeva, and the conversation grew lively, brilliant, and gay, like a flaming pyre. The Princess Betsy's husband, a tall, good-natured man, a passionate collector of engravings, hearing that his wife had guests, came into the drawing-room before going to his club, and desired to show himself in her circle. Noiselessly, on the thick carpet, he approached the Princess MaryAnn. "How did you like Nilsson?" he asked. "Ach! Do you steal upon a body that way? How you startled me!" she cried. "Don't speak to me about the opera, I beg you. You don't know anything about music. I prefer to descend to your level, and talk with you about your engravings and majolikas. Well, what treasures have you discovered lately?" "If you would like, I will show them to you, but you are no judge of them." "Show them to me, all the same. I am getting my education among these bankers, as you call them. They have lovely engravings. They like to show them." "Have you been at the Schützburgs?" asked the mistress of the house, from her place by the samovar. "Certainly, ma chère. They invited my husband and me to dinner, and they told me the sauce at this dinner cost 1,000 roubles," replied the Princess MaryAnn, in a loud voice, conscious that all were listening to her. "And it was a very poor sauce too, something green. I had to return the compliment, and I got them of a sauce that cost 85 kopecks, and all were satisfied. I can't make 1,000-rouble sauces." "She is unique," said the hostess. "Astonishing," said another. The Princess MaryAnn never failed of making her speeches effective, and the secret of their effectiveness lay in the fact that, although she did not always select suitable occasions, as was the case at the present time, yet she spoke simply and sensibly. In the society where she moved, what she said gave the effect of the most subtle wit. She could not comprehend why it had such an effect, but she recognized the fact, and took advantage of it. While the Princess MaryAnn was speaking, all listened to her, and the conversation around the ambassador's wife stopped, so the hostess, wishing to make the conversation more united, turned to the ambassador's wife and said, "Are you sure that you will not have some tea? Then please join us." "No, we are very well where we are, in this corner," replied the ambassador's wife, with a smile, resuming the thread of conversation which interested her very deeply. They were criticizing Karenin and his wife. "Anna is very much changed since her return from Moscow. There's something strange about her," said one of her friends. "The change is due to the fact that she brought back in her train the shadow of Alexei Vronsky," said the ambassador's wife. "What is that? There's a story in Grimm, a man without a shadow, a man deprived of his shadow. It was a punishment for something or other. I cannot see where the punishment lies, but it must be disagreeable for a woman to be without her shadow." "Yes, but the women who have shadows generally come to some bad end," said Anna's friend. "Hold your tongues!" cried the Princess Myakaya, as she heard these words. "Madame Karenina is a charming woman. I don't like her husband, but I like her." "Why don't you like her husband?" asked the ambassador's wife. "He is such a remarkable man. My husband says there are few statesmen in Europe equal to him." "My husband says the same thing, but I don't believe it," replied the Princess Myakaya. "If our husbands had not had this idea, we should have seen Alexey Alexandrovitch as he really is, and in my opinion he is a blockhead. I only say this in a whisper. Is it not true how everything comes out clearly? Formerly when I was told that he was clever, I used to try to discover it, and I came to the conclusion that I was stupid because I could not see wherein he was clever. But as soon as I said to myself, under my breath, he is stupid, all was explained. Isn't that so?" "How severe you are to-night." "Not at all. I have no other alternative. One of us two is stupid. Now you know that one can never say such a thing of oneself." "No one is satisfied with his circumstances, and every one is satisfied with his brain," said a diplomat, quoting a French couplet. "There, that is the very thing!" exclaimed the Princess Myakaya, turning to him. "But I make an exception of Anna. She is so lovely and good. Is it her fault if all men fall in love with her and follow her like shadows?" "Well, I do not allow myself to judge her," said Anna's friend, justifying herself. "Because no one follows us like a shadow, it does not prove that we have the right to judge." Having thus appropriately disposed of Anna's friend, the Princess Myakaya arose, and with the ambassador's wife drew up to the table, and joined in the general conversation about some trifle. "Whom have you been gossiping about?" asked Betsy. "About the Karenins. The princess has been picturing Alexey Alexandrovitch," replied the ambassador's wife, sitting down near the table with a smile. "Shame that we could not have heard it," said Betsy, looking toward the door. "Ah, here you are at last," said she, turning to Vronsky, who at that moment came in. Vronsky knew, and met every day, all the people whom he had found collected in his cousin's drawing‐room. Therefore he came in with the calmness of a man who rejoins his friends from whom he has only just parted. "Where have I come from?" said he, in a reply to a question from the ambassador's wife. "What can I do? I must confess, from Le Boeuf. 'Tis for the 100th time, and always with a new pleasure. It is charming. It is humiliating, I know, but I get sleepy at the opera. But at Le Boeuf I sit it out up to the very last minute, and enjoy it. To-night—" He mentioned a French actress, and was going to tell some story about her, but the ambassador's wife stopped him with an expression of mock terror. "Please don't speak to us of that fright." "Well, I will not, and the more willingly because you all know these frights." "And you would not go there if it were as fashionable as the opera," added the Princess Myakaya. Chapter 7 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Steps were heard near the door, and the Princess Betsy, knowing that it was Madame Karenina, looked at Vronsky. He was looking toward the door, and his face had a strange, new expression. Joyfully, expectantly, and almost timidly he gazed at Anna as she entered, and he rose slowly. Anna came into the drawing-room, as always holding herself very erect and looking neither to right nor to left. She crossed the short distance between her and the hostess with that rapid, light, but decided step which distinguished her from all the other women of this circle. She went directly up to Betsy and shook hands with a smile, and with the same smile she looked at Vronsky. He bowed low and offered her a chair. She responded only by bending her head a little, and blushed, and frowned. But instantly she was nodding to her acquaintances, and shaking hands. Then she turned to Betsy. "I have been at the Countess Lydia's. I wanted to get away earlier, but I was detained. Sir John was there. He was very interesting." "Oh, that missionary?" "Yes. He related many curious things about life in India." The conversation, which Anna's entrance had interrupted, again wavered, like the flame of a lamp in a draught. "Sir John? Yes, Sir John. I have seen him. He speaks well. The Vlasova is actually in love with him." "Is it true that the youngest Vlasova is going to marry Topov?" "Yes, people say that it is fully decided." "I am astonished at her parents. They say it is a love match." "A love match? What antediluvian ideas you have! Who speaks of love in our days?" said the ambassador's wife. "What is to be done about it? That foolish old custom is not entirely gone out of date," said Vronsky. "So much the worse for those who adhere to it. The only happy marriages that I know about are those of reason." "Yes, but how often it happens that these marriages of reason break like ropes of sand, precisely because of this love which you affect to scorn," said Vronsky. "But what we call a marriage of reason is where both parties take an equal risk. It is like scarlatina, through which we all must pass." "In that case it would be wise to find an artificial means of inoculation for love, as for smallpox." "When I was young I fell in love with a sacristan. I should like to know what good that did me," said the Princess Myakaya. "No, but jesting aside, I believe that to know what love really is, one must have been deceived once, and then been set right," said the Princess Betsy. "Even after marriage?" said the ambassador's wife, laughing. "It is never too late to mend," said the diplomatist, quoting the English proverb. "But really," interrupted Betsy, "you must be deceived, so as afterwards to get into the right path. What do you think about this?" she said, addressing Anna, who was listening silently to the conversation, with a scarcely perceptible smile on her firm lips. "I think," said Anna, playing with her glove, which she had removed, "I think, if there are as many opinions as there are heads, then there are as many ways of loving as there are hearts." Vronsky looked at her, and with a violent beating of the heart, waited for her answer. After she had spoken these words, he drew a deep breath, as if he had escaped some danger. She turned suddenly to Vronsky. "I have just had a letter from Moscow. They write me that Kitty Shtcherbatskaya is very ill." "Really?" said Vronsky with a frown. Anna looked at him with a severe expression. "Doesn't that interest you?" "It certainly does. I am very sorry. Exactly what did they write you, if I may be permitted to inquire?" Anna arose and went to Betsy. "Will you give me a cup of tea?" she said, standing behind her chair. While Betsy was pouring the tea, Vronsky went to Anna. "What did they write you?" "I often think that men do not know what nobility means, though they are all the time talking about it," said Anna, not answering his question. "I have been wanting to tell you for a long time," she added, and taking a few steps she sat down at a corner table laden with albums. "I don't quite know what your words mean," he said, offering her a cup of tea. She glanced at the divan near her, and he instantly sat down on it. "Yes, I have been wanting to tell you," she continued without looking at him. "You have acted badly, very badly." "Don't I know that I have? But whose fault was it?" "Why do you say that to me?" said she with a severe look. "You know why," he replied boldly and jealously, meeting her gaze and without dropping his eyes. She, not he, felt confused. This simply proves that you have no heart," said she. But her eyes told the story, and she knew that he had a heart, and therefore she feared him. "What you were talking about just now was error, not love." "Remember that I have forbidden you to speak that word, that hateful word," said Anna, trembling, and instantly she felt by the use of that one word "forbidden" she recognized a certain jurisdiction over him, and thus encouraged him to speak of love. "For a long time I have been wanting to say this to you," she continued, looking steadily into his eyes, and all aflame with the color that burned in her face. "I have come to-night on purpose, knowing that I should find you here. I have come to tell you this must come to an end. I have never had to blush before any one before, and you somehow cause me to feel guilty in my own eyes." He looked at her, and was struck with the new spiritual beauty of her face. "What do you want me to do?" he said simply and gravely. "I want you to go to Moscow and beg Kitty's pardon." "You do not want that," said he. He saw that she was compelling herself to say one thing while she really desired something else. "If you love me, as you say you do," she murmured, "then do what will give me peace." Vronsky's face lighted up. "Don't you know that you are my life? But I don't know what peace means, and I can't give it to you. Myself, my love, I can give. Yes, I cannot think of you and myself separately. But for me, you and I are one. I see no hope of peace for you or for me in the future. I see the possibility of despair, of misfortune, unless I see the possibility of happiness, and what happiness! Is it really impossible?" he murmured, with lips only, but she heard him. She directed all the forces of her mind to say what she ought, but instead of that, she looked at him with love in her eyes, and said nothing. "Ah," he thought with rapture, "at the very moment when I was in despair, when it seemed I should never succeed, it has come. She loves me. She confesses it." "Then do this for me, and never speak to me in this way again. Let us be good friends," said her words. Her eyes told a totally different story. "We can never be mere friends. You yourself know it. Shall we be the most miserable or the happiest of human beings? It is for you to decide." She began to speak, but he interrupted her. "You see I ask only one thing, the right of hoping and suffering as I do now. If it is impossible, order me to disappear, and I will disappear. You shall not see me if my presence is painful to you." "I do not wish to drive you away." "Then change nothing. Let things go on as they are," said he with a trembling voice. "Here is your husband." Indeed, Alexey Alexandrovitch at that instant was entering the drawing-room with his calm face and awkward gait. Glancing at his wife and Vronsky, he went first to the hostess, and then he sat down with a cup of tea, and in his slow, well-modulated voice, in his habitual tone of persiflage, which seemed always to deride some one or something, he said as he glanced around at the assembly, "Your Rambouillet is complete, the Graces and the Muses." But the Princess Betsy could not endure this sneering tone of his, as she called it, and, like a clever hostess, quickly brought him round to a serious discussion of the forced conscription. Alexey Alexandrovitch immediately entered into it, and began gravely to defend the new ukase against Betsy's attacks. Vronsky and Anna still sat near their little table. "That is getting rather pronounced," said a lady in a whisper, indicating with her eyes Karenina, Anna, and Vronsky. "What did I tell you?" said Anna's friend. Not only these ladies, but nearly all who were in the drawing-room, even the Princess Myakaya and Betsy herself, glanced more than once at them sitting apart from the general company, as if it disturbed them. Only Alexey Alexandrovitch never once looked in their direction, and was not diverted from the interesting conversation on which he had started. Betsy, perceiving the disagreeable impression that all felt, substituted some one else in her place to listen to Alexey Alexandrovitch, and crossed over to Anna. "I always admire your husband's clear and explicit language," she said. The most transcendental thoughts seem within my reach when he speaks." "Oh yes," said Anna, with a radiant smile of joy, and not understanding a word that Betsy had said. Then she went over to the large table and joined in the general conversation. After he had stayed half an hour, Alexey Alexandrovitch spoke to his wife, and proposed to her that they should go home together, but she answered, without looking at him, that she wished to remain to supper. Alexey Alexandrovitch took leave of the company and departed. Madame Karenina's coachman, the portly old Tartar, in his lacquered leather coat, was having some difficulty in restraining his left-hand grey, which was excited with the cold. A lackey stood holding open the carriage door. The Swiss was standing ready to open the outer door. Anna Arkadyevna was listening with ecstasy to what Vronsky whispered, while she was freeing, with nervous fingers, the lace of her sleeve, which had caught on the hook of her fur cloak. "You have said nothing, let us admit, and I make no claim," Vronsky was saying, as he accompanied her down. "But you know that it is not friendship that I ask for. For me, the only possible happiness of my life is contained in that word that you do not like, love." "Love," she repeated slowly, as if she had spoken to herself. Then suddenly, as she disentangled her lace, she said, "I do not like this word because it means too much, far more than you can imagine." And she looked him full in the face. "Das Vidanya." She reached him with her hand, and, with a quick elastic step, passed the Swiss and disappeared in her carriage. Her look, her pressure of his hand, filled Vronsky with passion. He kissed the palm on the place which she had touched, and went home with the happy conviction that that evening had brought him nearer to the goal of which he dreamed than all the 2 months past. Chapter 8 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Alexey Alexandrovitch found nothing unusual or improper in the fact that his wife and Vronsky had been sitting by themselves and having a rather lively talk together. He noticed that to others in the drawing-room it seemed unusual and improper, and therefore it seemed to him also improper. He decided that he ought to speak about it to his wife. When he reached home, Alexey Alexandrovitch, according to his usual custom, went to his library, threw himself into his armchair, and opened his book at the place marked by a paper cutter in an article on papistry, and read till the clock struck 1, as he usually did. From time to time he passed his hand across his high forehead, and shook his head, as if to drive away an importunate thought. At his usual hour he arose, and he prepared to go to bed. Anna Arkadyevna had not yet returned. With his book under his arm, he went upstairs, but that evening, instead of pursuing his usual train of reflections and thinking over his governmental duties, his mind was occupied with his wife and the disagreeable impression which her behavior had caused him. Contrary to his habit, instead of going to bed, he walked up and down the rooms with his arms behind his back. He could not go to bed because he felt that first it was incumbent upon him to ponder anew over the exigency that had arisen. When Alexey Alexandrovitch made up his mind that he must have a talk with his wife, it seemed to him very simple and natural. But now, as he reflected, it occurred to him that the matter was complicated and perplexing. Alexey Alexandrovitch was not jealous. Jealousy in his opinion was insulting to a wife, and a husband should trust in her. But he did not ask himself why one should trust her, that is to say, why a man should expect a young wife always to love him. But he had not felt any lack of confidence simply because he trusted her, and said to himself that it was the proper thing to do. But now, although it was his conviction that jealousy is a disgusting state of mind, and that it was his duty to trust his wife, and that his faith was still intact, yet he felt that he was placed in an illogical and ridiculous position, and he knew not what he ought to do. Alexey Alexandrovitch was now standing face to face with life, with the possibility that his wife was in love with some one else besides him, and this seemed to him very senseless and incomprehensible, because it was life itself. All his life he had lived and labored in a round of official duties concerned with the reflections of life, and whenever he came in contact with life itself he was revolted by it. Now he experienced a sensation such as a man feels who, passing calmly over a bridge above a precipice, suddenly discovers that the arch is broken, and that the abyss yawns beneath his feet. This abyss was actual life, the bridge, the artificial life which he had been living. The idea that his wife could love another man occurred to him for the first time, and filled him with terror. Without undressing, he kept walking back and forth with regular steps, over the echoing parquetry floor of the dining-room lighted with a single burner, over the carpet of the dark drawing-room, where the light fell on his recently painted full-length portrait, over the divan, and then through his wife's boudoir, where 2 candles were burning, lighting up the portraits of parents and friends, and the pretty trinkets upon her writing-table, so long familiar to him. When he reached the door of her bedroom, he turned and went back. At the end of each turn in his pacing back and forth, and especially on the hardwood floor of his brightly lighted dining-room, he would stop and say to himself, "Yes, this must certainly be cut short. It must be decided. I must tell her my way of looking at it." And then he would turn back again. "But what can I say? What decision can I make?" he would ask himself by the time he reached the drawing-room, and find no answer. "But, after all," he would say, as he turned in the library, "what has been done? Nothing. She had a long talk with him. What of that? But whom not does a society woman talk with? To be jealous is degrading both to her and me," he would say to himself as he reached her boudoir. But this reasoning, which had hitherto had such weight, had now lost its cogency. From the door of her sleeping-room he returned again to the hall, but, as he crossed the dark drawing-room, he thought he heard a voice saying to him, "It is not so. The fact that the others noticed this signifies that there must be something in it." And by the time he reached the dining-room again he was saying, "Yes, the thing must be decided, and broken short off." And once more in the drawing-room, just before he turned about, he would ask himself, "How can I decide? How can I tell her?" And then he would ask himself, "What had happened?" and reply, "Nothing," and remember that jealousy is a feeling degrading to a woman. But again in the drawing-room he would feel persuaded that something had happened. His thoughts, like his steps, followed the same circle, and he struck no new idea. He recognized this, rubbed his forehead, and sat down in her boudoir. There, as he looked at her table, with its malachite writing-tablet, and a letter unfinished, his thoughts took another direction. He began to think of her, and how she would feel. His imagination vividly showed him her personal life, her thoughts and her desires, and the idea that she might, that she must, have her individual life apart from his, seemed to him so terrible that he hastened to put it out of his mind. This was the abyss which it was so dreadful for him to gaze into. To penetrate by thought and feeling into the soul of another was a psychical effort strange to Alexey Alexandrovitch. He considered it a pernicious and dangerous mental habit. "And what is most terrible," he said to himself, "is that this senseless uncertainty comes on me just as I am about to bring my work to completion." He referred to a scheme which he was at that time managing. "And when I need perfect freedom from agitation, and all my mental powers, what is to be done? I am not one of those men who can endure agitation and annoyance, and have the strength of mind to face them. I must reflect. I must take some stand and get rid of this annoyance," he added aloud. "I do not admit that I have any right to probe into her feelings, or to scrutinize what is going on in her heart. That belongs to her conscience, and comes into the domain of religion," he said to himself, feeling some consolation that he had found a domain of law applicable to the circumstances that had arisen. So," he continued, "the questions related to her feelings and the like are questions of conscience, in which I have no concern. My duty lies clearly before me. As head of my family, I am bound to guide her, and therefore, to a certain degree, I am responsible. I must point out the danger which I see. I must watch over her and even use my powers. I must speak to her." And Alexey Alexandrovitch formulated in his mind everything that he should say to his wife. While he was thinking it over, he regretted the necessity of wasting his time and his intellectual powers in family matters. But, in spite of him, his plan assumed, in his thought, the clear, precise, and logical form of a report. "I must make her understand as follows. First, the meaning and importance of public opinion and decorum. Secondly, the religious significance of marriage. Thirdly, if necessary, the unhappiness which it might cause her son. Fourthly, the unhappiness which might befall herself." And Alexey Alexandrovitch twisted his fingers together, palms down, and made the joints crack. This gesture, of joining his hands and stretching his finger joints, a bad habit, calmed him, and conduced to the precision of which he now stood in such need. A carriage was heard driving up to the house. Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped in the middle of the hall. He heard his wife's step on the stairway. Alexey Alexandrovitch had his sermon all ready, but still he stood there, squeezing his crossed fingers and trying to make the joints crack. One joint cracked. Even as he heard her light steps on the stairs he was conscious of her presence, and, though he was satisfied with his sermon, he dreaded the explanation that was imminent. Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Anna entered with bent head, playing with the tassels of her bashlyk, or Turkish hood. Her face shone with a bright glow, but this bright glow did not betoken joy. It reminded one of the terrible glow of a conflagration against the midnight sky. When she saw her husband, she raised her head and smiled, as if she had awakened from a dream. "You are not abed yet? What a miracle!" she said, taking off her bashlyk, and, without pausing, she went into her dressing-room, crying, "It's late, Alexey Alexandrovitch," as she got to the door. "Anna, I must have a talk with you." "With me?" she said in astonishment, coming out into the hall and looking at him. "What is it? What about?" she asked and sat down. "Well, let us talk then, if it is so necessary, but I would much rather go to sleep." Anna said what came to her tongue, and was astonished to hear herself, astonished at her own facility at telling a lie. How perfectly natural her words sounded, and how probable that she wanted to go to sleep. She felt herself clad in an impenetrable armor of falsehood. She felt that some invisible power assisted her and sustained her. "Anna, I must give you a warning." "A warning?" she exclaimed. "Why?" She looked at him so innocently, so gaily, that anyone who did not know her as her husband did, would have noticed nothing unnatural either in the tone of her voice or in the meaning of what she said. But for him, who knew her, who knew that when he was 5 minutes later than usual she always remarked on it, and asked the reason, for him who knew that her first impulse was always to tell him of her pleasures and her sorrows, for him now to see the fact that Anna took special pains not to observe his agitation, that she took special pains not to say a word about herself, all this was very significant. He saw that the depths of her soul, hitherto always opened to his gaze, were now shut away from him. Moreover, by her tone he perceived that she was not confused by this, but as it were she said openly and without dissimulation, "Yes, I am a sealed book, and so it must be, and will be from henceforth." He felt as a man would who should come home and find his house barricaded against him. "Perhaps the key will yet be found," thought Alexey Alexandrovitch. "I want to warn you," said he, in a gentle voice, "lest by your imprudence and your thoughtlessness you give people cause to talk about you. Your rather too lively conversation this evening with Count Vronsky," he pronounced this name slowly and distinctly, "attracted attention." He finished speaking, and looked at Anna's laughing eyes, now terrible to him because they were so impenetrable, and he saw all the idleness and uselessness of his words. "You are always like this," she said, as if she had not understood him, and intentionally had understood only the last part of what he said. "Sometimes you don't like it because I am bored, and sometimes you don't like it because I have a good time. I was not bored this evening. Does that disturb you?" Alexey Alexandrovitch trembled. Again he stretched his fingers till the knuckles cracked. "Ah, I beg of you, don't crack your fingers. I detest it so," said she. "Anna, is this you?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, trying to control himself, and stopping the movement of his hands. "Yes, but what is it?" she asked, with a sincere and almost comic astonishment. "What do you want of me?" Alexey Alexandrovitch was silent, and passed his hand across his brow and over his eyes. He felt that, instead of having done as he intended, that is, instead of having warned his wife of her errors in the sight of the world, he was agitated at what concerned her conscience, and was perhaps striking some imaginary wall. "This is what I wanted to say," he continued coldly and calmly, "and I beg you to listen to me until I have done. As you know, I regard jealousy as an insulting and degrading sentiment, and I never allow myself to be led away by it. But there are certain laws of propriety which one cannot cross with impunity. This evening, judging by the impression which you made, I am not the only one that noticed it, all did. You did not conduct yourself at all in a proper manner." "Decidedly I do not understand at all," said Anna, shrugging her shoulders. "He does not really care," she thought. "All that he fears is the opinion of the world. You are not well, Alexey Alexandrovitch," she added, rising and starting to go to her room. But he stepped in front of her as if to prevent her from going. Never had Anna seen his face so displeased and ugly. She remained standing, tipping her head to one side, while with quick fingers she began to pull out the hairpins. "Well, I will hear what you have to say," she said in a calm, bantering tone. "I shall even listen with interest, because I should like to know what it is all about." She herself was astonished at the assurance and calm naturalness with which she spoke, as well as at her choice of words. "I have no right to examine your feelings. I think it is useless and even dangerous," Alexey Alexandrovitch began. "If we probe too deeply into our hearts, we run the risk of touching on what we ought not to perceive. Your feelings concern your conscience. But in presence of yourself, of me, and of God, I am in duty bound to remind you of your obligations. Our lives are united, not by men, but by God. Only by crime can this bond be broken, and such a crime brings its own punishment." "I don't understand at all. Oh, heavens, how sleepy I am!" said Anna, swiftly running her hand over her hair and taking out the last pin. "Anna, in the name of heaven, don't speak so," he said gently. "Maybe I am mistaken, but believe me, what I say to you is as much for your advantage as for mine. I am your husband, and I love you." Anna's face for an instant grew troubled, and the mocking fire disappeared from her eyes, but the word "love" irritated her. "Love," she thought. "Does he know what it means? If he had never heard that there was such a thing as love, he would never have used that word." "Alexey Alexandrovitch, truly, I don't know what you mean," she said. "They say you find—" "Allow me to finish. I love you, but I am not speaking for myself. Those who are chiefly interested are our son and yourself. It is quite possible, I repeat, that my words may seem idle and ill-judged. Possibly they are the result of mistake on my part. In that case, I beg you to forgive me. But if you yourself feel that there is the least foundation for my remarks, then I earnestly urge you to reflect, and, if your heart inclines you, to confide in me." Alexey Alexandrovitch, without noticing the fact, had spoken a very different discourse from the one that he had prepared. "I have nothing to say," and she added in a sprightly tone, scarcely hiding a smile, "Truly, it is time to go to bed." Alexey Alexandrovitch sighed, and, without speaking further, went to their chamber. When she reached the room he was already in bed. His lips were sternly set, and he did not look at her. Anna got into bed, every moment expecting that he would speak to her again. She both feared it and desired it, but he said nothing. She waited long without moving, and then forgot all about him. She was thinking of some one else. She saw him, and was conscious of her heart throbbing with emotion and with guilty joy. Suddenly she heard a slow and regular sound of snoring. Alexey Alexandrovitch at first seemed to be startled himself and stopped, but at the end of a second the snoring began again with monotonous regularity. "Too late, too late," she whispered with a smile. She lay for a long time thus, motionless, with open eyes, the shining of which it seemed to her she herself could see in the darkness. Chapter 10 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. From this time began a new life for Alexey Alexandrovitch and his wife. Nothing unusual happened. Anna continued to go into society, and was especially often at the Princess Betsy's, and everywhere she met Vronsky. Alexey Alexandrovitch saw it, but was powerless to prevent it. Whenever he tried to bring about an explanation, she raised up against him an impenetrable wall of humorless perplexity. Outwardly everything was the same, but their relations had completely changed. Alexey Alexandrovitch, a remarkably strong man in matters requiring statesmanship, here found himself powerless. Like an ox, submissively lowering its head, he waited the blow of the axe which he felt was lifted against him. Whenever he began to think about it, he felt that once more he must try by gentleness, tenderness, reason, to save Anna and bring her back to him. Every day he made up his mind to speak, but as soon as he made the attempt, that evil spirit of falsehood which possessed her seemed to lay hold of him also, and he spoke not at all in the tone in which he meant to speak. Involuntarily, what he said was spoken in his tone of raillery, which seemed to cast ridicule on those who would speak as he did. And this tone was not at all suitable for the expression of the thoughts that he wished to express. Chapter 10 Part 2, Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. What had been for nearly a whole year the sole desire of Vronsky's life, changing all his former desires, what Anna had looked upon as an impossible, a terrible, and therefore the more fascinating, dream of bliss, was at last realized. Pale, with quivering lower jaw, he stood over her, begging her to be calm, himself not knowing how or why. "Anna, Anna," he said with trembling voice, "Anna, for God's sake!" But the more intensely he spoke, the lower she hung her once proud, joyous, but now humiliated head, and she crouched all down, and dropped from the divan, where she had been sitting, to the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet had he not held her. "My God, forgive me!" she sobbed, pressing his hands to her breast. She felt that she was such a sinner and criminal that nothing remained for her except to crouch down and beg for forgiveness, and now there was nothing else for her in life but him, so that to him alone she turned her prayer for forgiveness. As she looked at him she felt her humiliation physically, and she could say no more. But he felt exactly as a murderer must feel when he sees the lifeless body of his victim. This lifeless body was their love, the first epoch of their love. There was something horrible and repulsive in the recollection of the terrible price that they had paid for this shame. The shame in the presence of their spiritual nakedness oppressed him and took hold of him. But in spite of all the horror felt by the murderer in the presence of the body of his victim, he must cut it in pieces, must bury it, must take advantage of his crime. And, as with fury and passion the murderer throws himself on the dead body and drags it and cuts it, so he covered her face and shoulders with kisses. She held his hand and did not stir. Yes, these kisses were what had been bought with this shame. Yes, and this hand, which will always be mine, is the hand of my accomplice. She raised his hand and kissed it. He fell on his knees and tried to look into her face, but she hid it and said nothing. At last, as if trying to control herself, she made an effort to rise, and pushed him away. Her face was still as beautiful as ever, even so much more was it pitiful. "All is ended," said she. "I have nothing but thee. Remember that." "I cannot help remembering it, since it is my life. A moment before this happiness—" "What happiness?" she cried, with contempt and horror. And horror involuntarily seized him also. "For God's sake, not a word more!" She quickly got up and moved away from him, and with a strange expression of hopeless despair, such as he had never seen before, on her face, she stood aloof from him. She felt that at that moment she could not express in words the sense of shame, rapture, and horror at this entrance into a new life, and she did not wish to speak about it or vulgarize the feelings with definite words. But even afterwards, on the next day, on the third day, not only did she fail to find words in which to express the complication of these feelings, but she could not even find thoughts by which to formulate to herself all that was in her soul. She said to herself, "No, I cannot think about this. By and by, when I am calmer." But this calmness never came. Every time when the questions arose, what had she done? And what would become of her? And what ought she to do? She was filled with horror, and she compelled herself not to think about them. "By and by," she repeated, "when I am calmer." On the other hand, during sleep, when she had no control of her thoughts, her situation appeared in its ugly nakedness. One dream almost every night haunted her. She dreamed that she was the wife both of Vronsky and of Alexey Alexandrovitch, and that both lavished their caresses on her. Alexey Alexandrovitch kissed her hands and said, weeping, "How happy we are now!" Alexey Vronsky also was there, and he was her husband. She was amazed that she had ever believed such a thing possible, and she laughed as she explained to them that this was far simpler, that both would henceforth be satisfied and happy. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she always awoke in a fright. End of chapter 11. Part 2, Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel. Even in the first weeks after Levin returned from Moscow, every time that with flushed cheeks and a trembling in his limbs he remembered the shame of his rejection, he would say to himself, "I blushed and trembled like this, and I felt that all was lost when I got 1 in physics and had to go into the second class. And I thought myself irretrievably ruined when I bungled in my sister's affairs, which were confided to me. And now the years have gone by, and I look back and wonder how it could disturb my mind. It will be just the same with my disappointment this time. Time will pass, and I shall grow callous." But 3 months passed away, and the callousness did not come, and it was as painful for him to remember it as on that first day. He could not reconcile himself to the fact that, after dreaming so long of family life, after being, as he thought, so well prepared for it, not only was he not married, but found himself farther than ever from marriage. He felt painfully, as all those around him felt, that it is not good for a man of his age to live alone. He remembered that before his departure from Moscow he had once said to his cowherd, Nikolai, a simple-hearted muzhik with whom he liked to talk, "Do you know, Nikolai, that I am thinking of getting married?" Whereupon Nikolai had instantly replied as if there could not be the slightest doubt about it, "This ought to have been long ago, Konstantin Dmitrich." And now marriage was farther off than ever. The place was taken, and when, exercising his imagination, he put into that place some young girl of his acquaintance, he felt that it was perfectly impossible. Moreover, the recollection of how Kitty refused him, and of the part which he played still tormented him with mortification. It was idle to say that he was not to blame in this. This recollection, taken together with other mortifying experiences of the same sort, made him quiver and grow red in the face. He had on his conscience, as every man has, the remembrance of evil deeds for which he should have repented. But the remembrance of these evil deeds did not trouble him nearly so much as the feeling of his humiliation, slight as it really was. It was a wound that refused to heal. He could not keep out of his mind his rejection, and the miserable position in which he must have been placed in the eyes of others. Time and labour, however, brought their balm. The painful impressions little by little began to fade in presence of the events of the country life, important in reality, in spite of their apparent insignificance. Each week his thoughts turned to Kitty with less frequency. He even began to await with impatience the news that she was married, or was going to be married, hoping that this event would bring healing in the same way as the pulling of a tooth may. Meantime spring came, beautiful, friendly, without treachery or false promises, a spring such as fills plants and animals, no less than men, with joy. This splendid season gave Levin new zeal, and confirmed his resolution to tear himself from the past so as to reorganize his solitary life on conditions of permanence and independence. Although many of the plans that he had formed on his return to the country had not been put into effect, yet the most essential one, that his life should be kept pure, had been realized. He experienced none of that sense of shame which ordinarily tormented him after a fall, and he could look fearlessly into men's eyes. In February he had received a letter from Marya Nikolaevna, who informed him that his brother's health was failing, and that he would not use any remedies. In consequence of this letter he had immediately gone to Moscow, where he persuaded Nikolai to consult a physician, and then to go abroad for the baths. He succeeded so well in persuading his brother and in lending him money for the journey without exasperating him, that he felt quite satisfied with himself. Besides his farm labourers, which especially occupied his attention that spring, and his ordinary reading, Levin was deeply engaged in writing a work on rural economy, which he had begun during the winter. His theory was that in farming the labourer's temperament is a factor as important as climate or the soil, and that consequently all the deductions of agronomic science are drawn, not from the premises of soil and climate alone, but from the soil, the climate, and the certain unchangeable character of the labourer. Thus, notwithstanding his loneliness, or in consequence of his loneliness, his life, therefore, was very busy and full. Only occasionally he felt the need of some one besides Agafya Mikhailovna, with whom to communicate the ideas that came into his head. However, he brought himself to discuss with her about physics, the theories of rural economy, and, above all, philosophy. Philosophy was Agafya Mikhailovna's favorite subject. The spring opened late. During the last weeks of Lent the weather was clear but cold. During the day the snow melted in the sun, but at night the mercury went down to 7°. The crust on the snow was so thick that carts could go anywhere across the fields. It snowed on Easter Sunday. Then suddenly, on the following day, a warm wind blew, the clouds drifted over, and for 3 days and 3 nights a warm and heavy rain fell ceaselessly. On Thursday the wind went down, and then over the earth was spread a thick grey fog, as if to conceal the mysteries that were accomplishing in nature. Under this fog the fields were covered with water, the ice was melting and disappearing, the brooks ran more swiftly, foaming and muddy. Toward evening the Krasnaya Gorka, or Red Hill, began to show through the fog, the clouds scattered like snipe, and spring in reality was there in all her brilliancy. The next morning the sun rose bright and quickly melted away the thin sheet of ice that still covered the ponds, and the warm atmosphere grew moist with the vapors rising from the earth. The old grass and the young blades peeping from the sod, with its tiny needles, the buds on the snowball trees, the currant bushes, and the sticky, sappy birch trees, grew green, swelled, and on their branches powdered with golden bloom, swarms of honeybees buzzed in the sun. Invisible larks trilled their songs over the velvet of the green and the prairies freed from snow. Lapwings lamented for their hollows and marshes, submerged by the stormy waters. The wild swans and geese flew high in the air with their calls of spring. The cattle, with rough hair and spots worn bare, lowed as they went out to pasture. The bandy-legged lambs gamboled around the bleating ewes, soon to lose their wool. Swift-footed children ran barefoot over the wet paths, where their footprints were left like fossils. The peasant women gossiped gaily around the edge of the pond, where they were bleaching their linen. And in the yards resounded the axes of the muzhiks, repairing their ploughs and their wagons. Spring had really come. End of chapter 12. Part 2, Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn Spiegel. Levin put on his heavy boots and, for the first time, his sleeveless cloth coat instead of his fur shuba, and went out to look over his estate, tramping through the brooklets which dazzled his eyes as they glanced in the sun, and stepping, now on a cake of ice, and now in sticky mud. Spring is the epoch of plans and projects. Levin, as he went out into his court, no more definitely knew what he would first take in hand in his beloved farming than the tree in early spring knows how and why his young sprouts and branches grow out from their enveloping buds. But he felt that he was going to originate the most charming projects and the most sensible plans. He went first to see his cattle. The cows had been let out into the yard, and with their smooth new coats of hair glistening as they warmed themselves in the sun, they were lowing as if to beg permission to go out to pasture. Levin knew them all, even to the minutest particulars. He contemplated them with satisfaction, and gave orders to take them to pasture and to let the calves out into the yard. The cowboy gaily started to drive them out into the field. The milkmaids, gathering up their petticoats and splashing through the mud with bare feet, white as yet and free from tan, chased the bellowing calves, silly with the rapture of spring, and with switches kept them from escaping from the yard. Admiring the young cattle which the year had brought, for they were uncommonly beautiful, the oldest already as large as a peasant's cow, and Pava's daughter, 3 months old, as big as a yearling, Levin ordered the trough to be brought out for them, and their hay to be given them behind gratings. He found, however, that these gratings, which had been made in the autumn but were not used during the winter, were out of repair. He sent for the carpenter, who was supposed to be busy repairing the threshing machine, but it seemed that the carpenter was not there. He was repairing the harrows, which should have been repaired during Lent. This made Levin very indignant. He was indignant at this everlasting repetition of such slovenliness, against which he had so many years struggled with all his might. The gratings, as he soon learned, had not been in use during the winter, had been carried to the stable, where, as they were of light construction and meant only for calves, they had been broken. Moreover, it appeared that nothing had been done to the harrows and other agricultural implements, which should have been inspected and put in order during the winter months, and for this purpose especially he had hired 3 carpenters. The harrows were needed immediately for work in the fields. Levin summoned the overseer. Then he himself went in search of him. The overseer, as radiant as everything else was that day, came from the threshing floor, dressed in a lined lambskin coat. He was twisting a straw between his fingers. "Why isn't the carpenter at work on the threshing machine?" "Oh, yes, that is what I meant to tell you last evening. The harrows had to be repaired. We've got to plough." "Yes, but what were you doing this winter?" "Yes, but why did you hire such a carpenter?" "Where are the gratings for the calves?" "I ordered them to be put in place. You can't do anything with such people," replied the overseer, waving his hands. "Not such people, but such an overseer," said Levin, getting still more angry. "Well, what do I keep you for?" he shouted, but recollecting that shouts did not do any good, he stopped in the middle of his remark and only sighed. "Well, can you get the seed in yet?" he asked after a silence. "Back of Turkino we might tomorrow, or the day after." "And the clover?" "I sent Vasily and Mishka to sow it, but I don't know whether they succeeded. It's muddy." "On how many acres?" 16 acres. "Why not the whole?" cried Levin. He was more indignant because they had sowed only 16 acres instead of 54. He knew by his own experience, as well as by theory, the need of sowing the clover seed as early as possible, almost in the snow, and Levin could never get this done. Not enough people. What can you do with these men? 3 hired men did not come, and then Simon. "Well, you would better have taken them away from the straw." "Yes, I did that very thing." "Where are all the people?" "There are 5 at the compote." He meant to say compost. 4 are moving the oats, so that they should not spoil. Konstantin Dmitrievitch. Levin knew very well that these words, "so that they should not spoil," meant that his English oats saved for seed were already ruined. Again they had not done what he had ordered. "Yes, but did I not tell you during Lent to put in the ventilating chimneys?" he cried. "Don't you be troubled, we will do it all in good time." Levin angrily waved his hand and went to examine his oats in the granary. Then he went to the stables. The grain was not yet spoiled, but the workmen were stirring it up with shovels when they might have let it down from one story to the other. After he had straightened this matter and sent 2 hands to sow the clover, Levin calmed down in regard to his overseer. It was such a lovely day that one could not keep angry. "Ignat!" he cried to his coachman, who, with upturned sleeves, was washing the carriage near the pump. "Saddle me a horse." "Which one?" "Well, Klopik." "I will do so." While he was saddling the horse, Levin again called the overseer, who was busying himself in his vicinity, hoping to be restored to favor, and began to speak with him about the work that he wanted done during the spring and about his plans for carrying on the estate. He wanted the compost spread as soon as possible, so as to have this work done before the first mowing. Then he wanted the farthest field ploughed so that it might be left fallow. All the fields, not half of them, should be attended to with the laborers. The overseer listened attentively, doing his best evidently to approve of his master's plans, but nevertheless his face wore that vexatiously hopeless and melancholy expression which Levin knew so well. This expression seemed to say, "This is all very well and good, but as God shall give." Nothing exasperated Levin so much as this tone, but it was common to all the overseers that had ever been in his service. They all received his projects with the same dejected air, and so he now refrained from getting angry, but he was exasperated, and felt himself still more stimulated for the struggle against this, as it were elemental, force which he could not help calling, as God shall give, and which constantly opposed him everywhere. "If we have time, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," said the overseer. "Why shall we not have time? We absolutely ought to hire 15 more workmen, but they can't be had. Some came to-day who asked 70 roubles for the summer." Levin did not speak. Again the opposing force. He knew that, however he might exert himself, he never could hire more than 40, 37, or 38 laborers at a reasonable price. He had succeeded in getting 40, never more, but nevertheless he could not give up vanquished. "Send to Sury, to Sheferovka. If they don't come, we must go for them." "I'm going to go," said Vasily Fedorovitch gloomily, "but then the horses are very feeble." "Buy some more, but then I know," he added with a laugh, "that you will do as little and as badly as you can. However, I warn you that I will not let you do as you please this year. I shall take the reins in my own hands." "Yes, but even as it is you get too little sleep, it seems to me. We are very happy to be under our master's eyes." "Now, have the clover put in on the Berezov bottom, and I shall come myself to inspect it," said he, mounting his little horse, Klopik, which the coachman brought up. "Don't go across the brooks, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," cried the coachman. "Well, then, by the woods." And on his little lively, easy-going ambler, which whinnied as it came to the pools and which pulled on the bridle, having been too long in the stable, Levin rode out of the muddy courtyard and across the open fields. Happy as Levin had felt in his cow-yard and cattle-pen, he felt still happier out in the field, rhythmically swaying on his easy-going, gentle pony, drinking in the warm air, freshened by the snow as he rode through the forest where the snow still lay here and there rapidly melting in the tracks. He took keen delight in every one of his trees, with greening moss and swelling buds. As he came out from the forest, before him lay a vast stretch of fields. They seemed like an immense carpet of velvet where there was not a bare spot or a marsh, only here and there in the hollows marked with patches of melting snow. The sight of a peasant's mare and colt treading down his fields did not anger him, but he ordered a passing muzhik to drive them out. With the same gentleness he received the sarcastic and impudent answer of the muzhik Ipat, whom he met and asked, "Ipat, shall we put in the seed before very long?" And Ipat replied, "We must plough first, Konstantin Dmitrievitch." The further he went, the more his good humor increased, and each of his plans for improving his estate seemed to surpass the other. To protect the fields on the south by lines of trees so as to prevent the snow from staying too long. To divide his arable fields into 9 parts, 6 of which should be well dressed and the other 3 sown down to grass. To build a cow-yard in the farthest corner of one field, and have a pond dug. To have portable enclosures for the cattle so as to utilize the manure, and thus to cultivate 300 desyatins of wheat, 100 desyatins of potatoes, and 150 of clover, without exhausting the soil. Full of these reflections, he picked his way carefully along so as not to tread down his fields, till at last he reached the place where the laborers were sowing the clover. The cart, loaded with seed, instead of being left on the edge of the field, had been driven into the ploughed land, and his winter wheat was crushed by the wheels and trampled down by the horse. The 2 laborers were sitting by the edge of the field, evidently smoking a mutual pipe. The earth in the cart, mixed together with the seed, had not been worked over, but was full of hard or frozen lumps. When he saw the master, the laborer Vasily started toward the cart, and Mishka began to sow. This was all wrong, but Levin rarely got angry with his laborers. When Vasily came up to him, Levin ordered him to lead the horse to the side of the field. "It won't do any harm, sir. It will spring up again." "Please do not discuss it," replied Levin, "but do what I say." "I will obey," said Vasily, taking the horse by the head. "What splendid seed, Konstantin Dmitrievitch! he added, to regain favour. "Best kind, but it is frightfully going. You drag a pud on each foot." "But why wasn't the earth sifted?" asked Levin. "Oh, it'll come out all right," replied Vasily, taking up some seed and crushing the lump in his palm. It was not Vasily's fault that they were scattering the unsifted soil, but it was vexatious, nevertheless. Having more than once to his advantage made use of a well-known means of wrecking his vexation, which always seemed to him foolish, Levin now determined to try it and see if he could recover his good temper. He noticed how Mishka strode along dragging huge clods of clay which stuck to each of his feet, so, dismounting, he took the seed cod from Vasily and began to scatter the seed. "Where did you stop?" Vasily touched the spot with his foot, and Levin went on as best he could scattering the earth with the seed. But it was hard as wading through a marsh, and after he had gone a row he stopped all in a sweat and returned to the seed cod. "Well, Baron, if that row doesn't come out well next summer, don't blame me for it," said Vasily. "Indeed I won't," replied Levin, gaily, already feeling the efficacy of the means he had employed. "But just look at the summer we're going to have. 'Twill be magnificent. If you'll notice, that's where I sowed last spring. How well I planted it! Why, Konstantin Dmitrich, I work as if I were working for my own father. Well, I don't like to do slack work. What is good for the master is good for us. And look yonder at that field," continued Vasily, pointing to the field. "It delights my heart." "It is a fine spring, Vasily." "Yes, it is such a spring as our old men can't remember. I was at home, and our elder had already sowed an acre of wheat, as he says he can hardly tell it from rye." "But how long have you been sowing wheat?" "Why, you yourself taught us how to sow it year before last. You spared me 2 measures. It gave 8 bushels, and we sowed an acre with it." "Well, look here, see that you break up the earth well," said Levin, as he started for his ambler. "Look after Mishka, and if the seed comes up well, you shall have 50 kopecks a desiatin." "We thank you humbly. We should be content even without that." Levin mounted his horse and rode off to visit his last year's clover field, and then to the field which was already ploughed ready for the summer wheat. The crop of clover in the stubble field was miraculous. It had all survived and was covering with a mantle of green all the ground where the preceding fall the roots of the wheat had been left. The horse sank up to the fetlock, and each foot made a sucking noise as he pulled it out of the half-thawed soil. It was entirely impossible to cross the ploughed land. Only where there was ice would it hold, but in the thawed furrows the horse's legs sank above the fetlock. The ploughed field was excellent. In 2 days the harrowing and sowing could be done. Everything was beautiful. Everything was gay. Levin rode back by way of the brooks, hoping to find the water lower. In fact, he found that he could get across, and, as he waded through, he scared up a couple of wild ducks. There ought to be snipe also, he thought, and a forest guard whom he met on his way to the house confirmed his supposition. He immediately spurred up his horse so as to get back in time for dinner, and to prepare his gun for the evening. Chapter 14. Part 2, Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Just as Levin reached home, in the best humor in the world, he heard the jingling of bells at the side entrance. "There now, someone from the railroad station," was his first thought. "It's time for the Moscow train. Who can have come? Brother Nikolai? Did he not say that instead of going abroad he might perhaps come to see me?" For a moment it occurred to him disagreeably that his brother Nikolai's presence might spoil his pleasant plans for the spring. But, disgusted at the selfishness of this thought, his mind, so to speak, instantly received his brother with open arms, and he began to hope, with affectionate joy, that it was really he. He hurried his horse, and as he came out from behind the acacia, he saw a hired troika from the railway station and a traveller dressed in a shuba. It was not his brother. "Ugh! If it is only some agreeable man to talk with," he thought. "Ah!" he cried, lifting up both arms as he recognized Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Here is the most delectable of guests. Ach, how glad I am to see you! I shall certainly learn from him if she is married, or when she is going to be," he added to himself. This splendid spring morning he felt that the memory of Kitty was not at all painful. "You scarcely expected me, I suppose," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, leaping out of the sledge, with spots of mud on the bridge of his nose, on his cheeks, and on his forehead, but radiant with health and pleasure. "I am come, first, to see you," he cried, throwing his arms around Levin and kissing him. "Secondly, to shoot a few birds, and thirdly, to sell the forest at Yergushovo." "Perfect, isn't it? What do you think of this spring? But how could you have got here in a sledge?" "Travelling is far worse with a telyaga, Konstantin Dmitrievitch," replied the postilion, who was an acquaintance. "Well, indeed I am delighted to see you again," said Levin, with a genuine smile of boyish joy. He conducted his guest to the room kept in readiness for visitors, and had Stepan Arkadyevitch's things brought up, a gripsack, a gun in its case, and a box of cigars, and then, leaving him to wash and dress himself, he went down to his office to speak about the clover and the ploughing. Agafya Mikhailovna, who had very much at heart the honor of the mansion, met him in the vestibule with questions about dinner. "Do just as you please," replied Levin, as he went out. "Only make haste about it," said he, and went to the overseer. When he returned, Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had washed and combed his hair, was just coming out of his room with a radiant smile, and together they went upstairs. "Well, I am very happy to have got out to your house at last. I shall now learn the mystery of your existence here. Truly, I envy you. What a house! How convenient everything is! How bright and delightful!" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, forgetting that bright days and the springtime were not always there. "And your old nurse! What a charming old soul! All that's lacking is a pretty little chambermaid with an apron on. But that does not suit your severe monastic style. But this is very good." Stepan Arkadyevitch had much interesting news to tell. Especially interesting to Levin was the tidings that his brother, Sergey Ivanovitch, expected to come into the country this summer. But not one word did Stepan Arkadyevitch say about Kitty or any of the Shtcherbatskys. He simply transmitted his wife's greeting. Levin was grateful to him for this delicacy. As usual, he had stored up during his hours of solitude a throng of ideas and impressions which he could not share with any of his domestics, and now he poured into Oblonsky's ears his poetical spring joys, his failures and plans and farming projects, his thoughts and his observations on the books which he had read, and above all the idea of his treatise, the scheme of which consisted, though he himself had not noticed it, of a critique on all former works on farming. Stepan Arkadyevitch, amiable and always ready to grasp a point, showed usual cordiality, and Levin even thought that he noticed a certain flattering consideration in an undertone of tenderness in his treatment of him. The efforts of Agafya Mikhailovna and the cook to get up an especially good dinner resulted in the two friends, who were half starved, betaking themselves to the zerkassa or lunch table and devouring bread and butter, cold chicken, and salted mushrooms, and finally in Levin calling for the soup without the little pasties which the cook had made in hope of surprising the guest. But Stepan Arkadyevitch, though he was used to different kinds of dinners, found everything excellent. The travnik or herb beer, the bread, the butter, and especially the cold chicken, the mushrooms, the shchi or cabbage soup, the fowl with white sauce, and the white Crimean wine, everything was admirable, wonderful. "Perfect! Perfect!" he cried, as he lit a big cigarette after the roast. "I feel as if I had escaped the shocks and noise of a ship, and had landed on a peaceful shore. And so you say that the element represented by the working man ought to be studied above all others, and be taken as a guide in the choice of economy expedients. You see, I am a profanus in these questions. But it seems to me that this theory and its applications would have an influence on the working man. Yes, but hold on. I'm not speaking of political economy, but of rural economy considered as a science. You must study the premises, the phenomena, just the same as in the natural sciences, and the working man from the economical and ethnographical point of view. But here Agafya Mikhailovna entered with the dessert of preserves. "Well, now, accept my compliments, Agafya Mikhailovna," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, kissing the ends of his hairy fingers. "What nice baked chicken! What delicious beer! Well, Kostya, isn't it time to go?" he added. Levin looked out of the window toward the sun, which was sinking behind the tree-tops, still bare and leafless. "It is time. Kuzma, have the horses hitched up," he cried as he went downstairs. Stepan Arkadyevitch followed him, and carefully removed the canvas covering from the lacquered case, and, having opened it, proceeded to take out his costly gun, which was of the newest pattern. Kuzma, already scenting a generous fee, gave him assiduous attention, and helped him put on his stockings and his hunting boots, and Stepan Arkadyevitch accepted his aid complacently. "If the merchant Rabinin comes while we are gone, Kostya, I told him to be here today. Do me the favor to have him kept till we get back." "Are you going to sell your wood to Rabinin?" "Yes. Why, do you know him?" "Oh, certainly I know him. I have done business with him, positively and finally." Stepan Arkadyevitch burst into a laugh. Positively and finally were the favorite words of the merchant. "Yes, he is very droll in his speech. She knows where her master is going," he added, patting Laska, who was jumping and barking around Levin, licking now his hand, now his boots and gun. A dolgusha, or hunting wagon, was waiting at the steps as they came out. "I had the horses put in, although we have but a little distance to go," said Levin. "But would you rather walk?" "No, I prefer to ride," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch, as he mounted the wagon. He sat down, tucking round his legs a striped plaid, and lighted a cigar. "How can you get along without smoking, Kostya? A cigar! It is not only a pleasure, it is the very crown and sign of delight. This is life indeed! How delightful! I should like to live like this." "What's to prevent?" asked Levin with a smile. "Yes, but you are a fortunate man, for you have everything that you like. You like horses, you have them. Dogs, you have them. Hunting, here it is. An estate, here it is." "Perhaps it is because I enjoy what I have, and don't covet what I have not," replied Levin, with Kitty in his mind. Stepan Arkadyevitch understood, and looked at him without speaking. Levin was grateful to Oblonsky because he avoided speaking about the Shtcherbatskys, with his usual tact, perceiving that Levin dreaded to speak about them. But now he felt anxious to find out how matters stood, but he did not dare to inquire. "Well, how go your affairs?" asked Levin, realizing how selfish it was in him to think only of himself. Oblonsky's eyes glistened with gaiety. "You will not admit that one can want hot rolls when he has his monthly rations. In your eyes it is a crime. But for me, I cannot admit the possibility of living without love," he replied, construing Levin's question in his own fashion. "What's to be done about it? I am so constituted. And it is a fact. It does so little harm to anyone else, and gives one so much pleasure." "What? There is a new one, is there?" asked Levin. "There is, brother. You know the type of the woman in Ossian? These women that you see in dreams. But they really exist, and are terrible. Woman, you see, is an inexhaustible theme. You can never cease studying her. She always presents some new phase." "So much the better not to study her, then." "Not at all. Some mathematician has said that happiness consisted in searching for truth and never finding it." Levin listened and said no more, and, notwithstanding all the efforts which he made, he could not in the least enter into his friend's soul, and understand his feelings and the charm of studying such women. Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. The place where the birds collected was not far away, by a small stream flowing through an aspen grove. Levin got out and took Oblonsky to a nook in a mossy, somewhat marshy meadow, where the snow had already melted. He himself went to the opposite side, near a double birch, rested his gun on the fork of a dead branch, took off his caftan, clasped a belt about his waist, and ensured the free motion of his arms. Old grey Laska, following him step by step, sat down cautiously in front of him, and pricked up her ears. The sun was setting behind the great forest, and against the bright sky the young birches and aspens stood out distinctly, with their bending branches and their swelling buds. In the forest, where the snow still lay, the low rippling sound of waters could be heard running in their narrow channels. Little birds were chirping and flying from tree to tree. In the intervals of perfect silence one could hear the rustling of the last year's leaves, moved by the thawing earth or the pushing herbs. "Why, one can really hear and see the grass grow," said Levin to himself, as he saw a moist and slate-colored aspen leaf raised by the blade of a young herb starting from the sod. He stood, listening and looking, now at the damp moss-covered ground, now at the watchful Laska, now at the bare tree-tops of the forest, which swept like a sea to the foot of the hill, and now at the darkening sky, where floated little white bits of cloud. A hawk flew aloft, slowly flapping his broad wings above the distant forest. Another took the same direction and disappeared. In the thicket the birds were chirping louder and more gaily than ever. Not far away, an owl lifted his voice, and Laska pricked up her ears again, took 2 or 3 cautious steps, and bent her head to listen. On the other side of the stream a cuckoo sang. Twice it uttered its customary cry, and then its voice grew hoarse. It flew away and was heard no more. "Why, the cuckoo has come," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, coming out from behind his thicket. "Yes, I hear," said Levin, disgusted that the silence of the forest was broken by the sound even of his own voice. "You won't have to wait long now." Stepan Arkadyevitch returned to his place behind his thicket, and Levin saw only the flash of a match and the red glow of his cigarette and a light bluish smoke. Chick, chick. Stepan Arkadyevitch cocked his gun. "What was that making that noise?" he asked of his companion, attracting his attention to a protracted humming, as if a colt was neighing with a very slender voice. "Don't you know what that is? That is the buck-rabbit. Don't speak any more. Listen, there is a bird," cried Levin, cocking his gun. A slender, distinct whistle was heard, with that rhythmic regularity which the huntsman knows so well. Then, a moment or two later, it was repeated, nearer, and suddenly changed into a hoarse little cry. Levin turned his eyes to the right, to the left, and finally saw just above his head, against the fading blue of the sky, above the gently waving aspens, a bird flying. It flew straight toward him. Its cry, like the noise made by tearing stiff cloth, rang in his ears. Then he distinguished the long bill and the long neck of the bird, but hardly had he caught sight of it when a red flash shone out from behind Oblonsky's bush. The bird darted off like an arrow and rose into the air again, but again the light flashed and a report was heard, and the bird, vainly striving to rise, flapped its wings for a second and fell heavily to the wet earth. "Did I miss?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, who could see nothing through the smoke. "Here she is!" cried Levin, pointing to Laska, who, with one ear erect and waving the tip end of her hairy tail, slowly, as if to lengthen out the pleasure, came back with the bird in her mouth, seeming almost to smile as she laid the game down at her master's feet. "Well now, I am glad you succeeded," said Levin, though he felt a slight sensation of envy, because he himself had not killed this snipe. "The right barrel missed, curse it!" replied Stepan Arkadyevitch, reloading his gun. "Shh! Here's another." In fact, the whistles came thicker and thicker, rapid and sharp. 2 snipe flew over the hunters, playing, chasing each other, and only whistling, not clucking. 4 shots rang out, and the snipe, making a sudden turn like swallows, disappeared from sight. The sport was excellent. Stepan Arkadyevitch killed 2 others, and Levin also 2, one of which was lost. It grew darker and darker. Venus, with silvery light, shone out low in the west from behind the birches, and high in the east Arcturus gleamed with his sombre reddish fire. Above his head Levin found and lost the stars of the Great Bear. The snipe had now ceased to fly, but Levin resolved to wait until Venus, which was visible above the birch trees, should stand clear above the lower branches, and till all the stars of the Great Bear should be entirely visible. The star had passed beyond the birch trees, and the wane of the Great Bear with its pole was shining out clear in the dark blue sky, and he was still waiting. "Isn't it getting late?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. All was calm in the forest, not a bird moved. "Let us wait a little longer," replied Levin. "Just as you please." At this moment they were not 15 paces apart. "Stiva," cried Levin suddenly, "you have not told me whether your sister-in-law is married yet, or whether she is to be married soon." He felt so calm, his mind was so thoroughly made up, that nothing, he thought, could move him. But what Stepan Arkadyevitch answered was wholly unexpected. "She is not married, and she is not thinking of marriage. She is very ill, and the doctors have sent her abroad. They even fear for her life." "What did you say?" cried Levin. "Very ill? What is the matter? How did she—" While they were talking thus, Laska, with ears erect, was gazing at the sky above her head, and looking at them reproachfully. "This is not the time to talk," thought Laska. "Ah, here comes one. There he goes. They will miss him." At the same instant a sharp whistle pierced the ears of the two huntsmen, and both, leveling their guns, shot at once. The two reports, the two flashes, were simultaneous. The snipe, flying high, folded his wings, drew up his delicate legs, and fell into the thicket. "Excellent! Both together!" cried Levin, running with Laska in search of the game. "Oh, yes! What was it that hurt me so much just now? Ah, yes, Kitty was ill," he remembered. "What is to be done about it? It is too bad. Ah, she has found it. Good dog!" said he, taking the bird, still warm, from Laska's mouth, and putting it into his overflowing game bag. "Come on, Stiva!" he cried. Chapter 16 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. On their way home, Levin questioned his friend about Kitty's illness and the plans of the Shtcherbatskys. Though it caused some conscientious scruples, what he heard was pleasant news to him. It was pleasant because it left him with some grounds for hope, and it was still more pleasant to think that she who had caused him so much suffering was suffering herself. But when Stepan Arkadyevitch began to speak of the reason of Kitty's illness, and pronounced the name of Vronsky, he interrupted him. "I have no right to know these family matters, since I am not concerned." Stepan Arkadyevitch smiled imperceptibly as he noticed the sudden and characteristic change in Levin, who, in an instant had passed from gaiety to sadness. "Have you succeeded in your transaction with Rabinin about the wood?" he asked. "Yes, I have made the bargain. He gives me an excellent price, 38,000 roubles, 8 in advance and the rest in 6 years. I had been long about it, and no one offered me any more." "That means you are selling your wood for a song," said Levin, frowning. "Why so?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, with a good-humored smile, knowing that now Levin would totally disapprove of everything. "Because your wood is worth at least 500 roubles a desyatin." "Oh, you rural economists!" replied Stepan Arkadyevitch banteringly. "What a tone of scorn to us, your city brother! And yet, when it comes to business matters, we come out of it better than you do. Believe me, I have made a careful calculation. The wood is sold under very favorable circumstances, and I fear only one thing, and that is lest the merchant will back out of it. You see, it is wretched wood," he went on, accenting the word wretched, as if to convince Levin of the unfairness of his criticism, "and nothing but firewood. There will not be much more than 30 cords to the acre, and he pays me at the rate of 200 roubles." Levin smiled scornfully. "I know these city people," he thought, "who coming twice in 10 years into the country, and learning 2 or 3 country words, which they use appropriately or inappropriately, are firmly persuaded that they know it all. Wretched! Only 30 cords! He speaks words without knowing what he is talking about. "I do not pretend to teach you what you write in your office," said he, "and, if I needed, I would even ask your advice. But you are so sure that you understand this whole document about the wood. It is hard. Have you counted the trees?" "What, count my trees?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, with a laugh, and still trying to get his friend out of his ill humor. "Count the sands, the ray of the planets. The lofty genius might. Well now, I tell you the lofty genius of Rabinin may. Never does a merchant purchase without counting, unless, indeed, the wood is given away for nothing, as you have done. I know your forest. I go hunting there every year, and your forest is worth 500 rubles a desyatin cash down, and he has given you only 200 and on a long term. That means you make him a present of 30,000. "Well, enough of imaginary receipts," said Stepan Arkadyevitch plaintively. "Why didn't someone offer me this price?" "Because the merchants connive together. I have had to do with all of them. I know them. They are not merchants, but speculators. None of them is satisfied with a profit less than 10 or 15%. They wait till they can buy for 20 kopecks what is worth a ruble." "Well enough. You are out of sorts." "Not at all," said Levin sadly, as they were approaching the house. A small cart, tightly bound with iron and leather, drawn by a fat horse, tightly harnessed with wide straps, was standing at the entrance. In the cart sat a red-faced overseer tightly belted, who served Rabinin as a coachman. Rabinin himself was already in the house, and met the two friends in the vestibule. Rabinin was a man of middle age, tall and thin, wearing a mustache, but his prominent chin was well shaven. His eyes were protuberant and muddy. He was clad in a dark blue coat with buttons set low behind, and he wore high boots, wrinkled around the ankles and smooth over the calves, and over his boots huge galoshes. Wiping his face with his handkerchief and wrapping his overcoat closely around him, though without that it fitted him well enough, he came out with a smile to meet the gentlemen as they entered. He gave one hand to Stepan Arkadyevitch as if he wanted to grasp something. "Ah, here you are," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, shaking hands. "Very good. I should not have ventured to disobey your Excellency's orders, though the roads are very bad. Positively, I came all the way on foot, but I got here on time. A greeting to you, Konstantin Dmitrich," said he, turning to Levin, intending to seize his hand also, but Levin, frowning, affected not to notice the motion, and began to take out the snipe. "You have been enjoying a hunt? What kind of a bird is that?" asked Rabinin, looking at the snipe disdainfully. "I suppose it has a peculiar flavor," and he shook his head disapprovingly, as if he felt doubtful whether the game were worth the candle. "Would you like to go to the library?" said Levin, darkly scowling, addressing Stepan Arkadyevitch in French. "Go to the library and discuss your business there." "Just as you please," replied the merchant, in a tone of disdainful superiority, apparently wishing it to be understood that others might find difficulties in transacting business, but that he never could. As he entered the library, Rabinin glanced about as if his eyes were in search of the holy image, but when he caught sight of it, he did not cross himself. He glanced at the bookcases and the shelves lined with books, and with the same air of doubt that the snipe had caused, he smiled scornfully and shook his head disapprovingly, as if this kind of game also were not worth the candle. "Well, did you bring the money?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Sit down." "The money will come all in good time. But I came to see you and have a talk." "What have we to talk about? However, sit down." "May as well sit down," said Rabinin, taking a chair, and leaning back in it in the most uncomfortable attitude. "You must give a trifle, Prince. It would be sinful not to do it. As to the money, it is all ready, absolutely and finally even to the last kopeck. As far as the money goes, there will be no delay." Levin, who had been putting his gun away in the armory and was just leaving the room, stopped as he heard the last words. "You bought that wood for a song," said he. "He came to visit me too late. I would have had a good price for it." Rabinin arose and smilingly contemplated Levin from head to foot, but said nothing. "Konstantin Levin is very sharp," said he at length, turning to Stepan Arkadyevitch. "One never succeeds in arranging a bargain finally with him. I have bought wheat, and paid good prices. Why should I give you my property for a song? I did not find it in the ground, nor did I steal it." "Excuse me. At the present day it is absolutely impossible to be a thief. Everything is done, in the present day, honestly and openly. Who could steal, then? We have spoken honestly and honorably. The wood is too dear. I shall not make the two ends meet. I beg him to yield a little." "But is your bargain made, or is it not? If it is made, there is no need of haggling. If it is not," said Levin, "I am going to buy the wood." The smile suddenly disappeared from Rabin's lips. A rapacious and cruel expression, like that of a bird of prey, came in its place. With his bony fingers he tore open his overcoat, bringing into sight his shirt, his waistcoat with its copper buttons, and his watch chain, and from his breast pocket he pulled out a huge well-worn wallet. "Excuse me, the wood is mine!" he exclaimed, making a rapid sign of the cross, and he extended his hand. "Take your money, the wood is mine. This is how Rabinin ends his transactions. He does not reckon his kopecks," said he, knitting his brows and waving his wallet eagerly. "If I were in your place, I should not be in haste," said Levin. "Mercy on me!" said Oblonsky, astonished. "I have given my word." Levin dashed out of the room, slamming the door. Rabinin glanced at the door and shook his head. "Merely the effect of youth. Definitely. Pure childishness. Believe me, I buy this, so to speak, for the sake of glory, so that they may say, 'It's Rabinin, and not someone else, who has bought Oblonsky's forest.' And God knows how I shall come out of it. Have faith in God. Please sign." An hour later the merchant, carefully wrapping his khalat around him, and buttoning up his overcoat, took his seat in his cart and drove home, with the agreement in his pocket. "Oh, these gentlemen," he said to the overseer, "always the same story." "So it is," replied the prikazchik, giving up the reins so as to arrange the leather boot. "And your little purchase, Mikhail Ignatiitch?" "Well, well." Chapter 17